10 days. $700,000. The most advanced diagnostic technology on the planet. And a $17 million Bugatti that still wouldn't start. When Vivian Hawthorne, the 30-year-old self-made billionaire who built America's most powerful luxury automotive empire, ran out of options, the last person anyone expected to walk through her doors was a quiet single father in a worn jacket, driving a dented pickup truck with his 8-year-old daughter asleep in the passenger seat. He wasn't invited. He wasn't credentialed. He was just making a delivery. What happened next, in 5 minutes flat, would shake an entire industry to its foundation. If this is your kind of story, hit that like button right now and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Bugatti arrived on a flatbed truck at 6:14 in the morning, which was how Vivian Hawthorne knew it was going to be a bad day. Not because of the hour. She'd been awake since 4:30, the way she'd been awake since 4:30 nearly every morning for the past 3 years. Ever since the company crossed $2 billion in annual revenue and sleep started feeling like a liability. No, it was something else. It was the way the flatbed driver kept glancing in his side mirror as he backed into the private service bay, careful, deliberate, like he was transporting something holy, and the way the two men riding with him didn't speak a single word to each other during the entire unloading process. You learn things from silence like that. The car itself was a Bugatti Chiron Supersport in nocturne blue. A custom commission that had taken 14 months to build and had never been driven on a public road. It belonged to Vivian's personal collection, the one she kept separate from inventory, the one she'd built not as investments, but as, she hated the word, but there it was, feelings. Objects she'd acquired during specific moments of her life that she wanted to hold on to somehow. The Chiron she'd ordered the week her company went public. She'd signed the paperwork at 9 in the morning and placed the commission call to Molsheim at 9:45. It had cost just under $17 million. Not because she needed to spend $17 million on a car, but because of what $17 million freely spent had meant at the time. It meant she'd made it, and now it wouldn't start. She stood at the edge of the service bay with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched yet, watching the crew position the flatbed and lower the hydraulic ramp. And she thought about the past 10 days in the specific, compressed way she'd trained herself to think about failures. Not emotionally, but structurally. What had gone wrong, and where, and why, and what it was going to cost to fix it. The answer to that last question was already two things she didn't like: $700,000 and approximately zero forward progress. It had started with a phone call from Marcus, her head of private collection management, 9 days before. The Chiron had been in climate-controlled storage since February, which was standard practice for anything she wasn't actively driving. Marcus had gone in to run the weekly systems check, battery voltage, fluid levels, tire pressure, the usual, and found that the car wouldn't respond to the key fob, not a dead battery. The car's own systems were reading power. It simply wouldn't initialize. He'd called her at 7 in the morning, apologetic in that way Marcus always was when something went wrong, which was part of why she trusted him and part of why these conversations took twice as long as they needed to. "It's probably something simple," he'd said. "These things happen with the Chiron sometimes. Apparently, there's a firmware issue that—" "Get someone in to look at it today," she'd said. "I already called Henriksen's. They can send a certified technician, but I don't want a technician. I want the person who runs diagnostics, not someone who runs a checklist." There was a pause. "That would be Dr. Reginald Forsyth. He's Henriksen's senior systems specialist. He flew in from Frankfurt last year to handle the Koenigsegg recall, so book him." Dr. Forsyth arrived the following morning with a rolling case of equipment worth, as he mentioned twice without being asked, roughly $90,000. He spent 4 hours running diagnostics, spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had delivered bad news to rich people before and knew that cadence was itself a kind of currency, and told Vivian that the ECU was showing anomalous behavior that he'd need to investigate further. "How much further?" she'd asked. "I'd like to bring in a secondary specialist." The secondary specialist arrived 2 days later from London. He brought different equipment and reached different conclusions about the same problem, which was how Vivian understood that neither of them actually knew what was wrong. She kept that understanding to herself because experience had taught her that the moment a room full of experts sensed you doubting them, they stopped thinking about the problem and started defending their credentials. By day 5, there were 11 people in her private service bay. By day 7, there were 16, including 2 who'd flown in specifically from the Bugatti automobiles factory in Molsheim, France, carrying a sealed case of replacement components and a laptop with direct access to the original build documentation for chassis number 4471. The replacement components didn't help. Neither did the build documentation. The car sat in the center of the bay under the LED wash of 8 overhead work lights, surrounded by thousands of dollars of diagnostic equipment, and remained completely, absolutely, infuriatingly inert. Vivian had a particular way of processing ongoing failure. She didn't panic early. Panic was expensive and almost always premature. She didn't catastrophize. What she did, privately, alone in the early mornings before the workday started, was calculate exposure. Not just financial exposure, though that mattered. Reputational exposure, narrative exposure. The story that other people might start to tell. That was the thing nobody talked about when you built something the size of Hawthorne Automotive Group. The higher you got, the more other people's stories about you started to matter. Not because you needed their approval, but because those stories had structural weight. They built or eroded trust. They shaped how your partners thought, how your investors felt when they opened an earnings call, how a journalist framing a profile piece decided which details to include and which to leave out. Hawthorne Automotive Group was the largest privately held luxury vehicle retailer in the United States. She'd taken it from her father's single dealership in Connecticut, a struggling Mercedes-Benz franchise with decent inventory and terrible management, and built it into 47 locations across 19 states over a 9-year span. She'd done it through a specific combination of things: aggressive acquisition strategy, obsessive attention to service culture, and an almost pathological refusal to let a problem go unresolved longer than 24 hours. The Chiron problem was now on day 10. The coverage had started 4 days ago, a small item in Automotive Week noting that a significant technical anomaly had emerged with a bespoke hypercar belonging to a prominent American collector, with sources close to the situation suggesting that multiple international specialists had thus far been unable to identify the cause. The item was carefully hedged, written in the way trade press covered these things when they weren't sure of their facts, but were sure something was interesting. Vivian read it at 5 in the morning and had Marcus on the phone by 5:15. "Find out who their source is," she said. "I don't think we can. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm asking you to figure out which of the 16 people in that garage talked to a journalist." He found out by the following afternoon. It was one of the Molsheim engineers, a young man who'd apparently texted a colleague at a rival firm and whose colleague had apparently passed the information along. Vivian didn't fire him. He was Bugatti's employee, not hers, and making a scene about it would generate more coverage than the original item. But she had Marcus make clear that any further communication with outside parties would result in his team being removed from the engagement immediately. What she couldn't control was the follow-up coverage. By day 8, 3 separate automotive journalists had picked up the story. By day 9, one of the larger automotive YouTube channels, the kind with 6 million subscribers and an instinct for the particular combination of technical drama and class mythology that performed well online, had posted a video titled "Why Can't Bugatti Fix the Billionaire's Chiron?" that had 1.4 million views by the time Vivian's social media director flagged it for her. The video's comment section was enthusiastic and unsparing in the way comment sections always were. Maybe try turning it off and on again. Imagine paying $17 million for something that won't start. My 2009 Civic never lets me down. At this point, just set it on fire and claim insurance. She read through roughly 40 comments before closing the tab. The morning of day 10, she decided she was going to let everyone go. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a confrontation. She was going to have Marcus inform Dr. Forsyth, Dr. Forsyth's London colleague, the 2 Molsheim engineers, and the 9 other specialists who had accumulated in her service bay over the preceding 9 days, that their services were no longer required, that Hawthorne Automotive Group would of course honor all contractual obligations, and that she appreciated their efforts. She'd then call the one person she probably should have called first, which was Etienne Marchot, the retired chief electrical systems architect for Bugatti's Hypersport division, who was now 73 years old and living in a village outside Lyon, and famously difficult to reach and even more famously expensive. She'd resisted calling him because reaching out to Marchot was, in the insular world of hypercar specialists, a signal that you'd exhausted all other options. It was an admission she hadn't wanted to make. She was ready to make it now. She was on her way from the main building to the service complex, coffee in hand, still not touched, still exactly the temperature it had been when she poured it 20 minutes ago. When Marcus caught up with her in the corridor outside the executive wing. "The parts delivery arrived," he said, "about 20 minutes early. I was going to have them use the side entrance, but I don't need to know about parts deliveries, Marcus." "No, I know. It's just—" He paused in a way she recognized, the pause he used when something had happened that he wasn't sure how to describe. One of the delivery men asked about the Chiron. She kept walking. "Which delivery service?" "Rider and daughter. Small outfit, they do specialty components for a few of the independent shops we source from. The owner drives himself, apparently." Another pause. He asked one of the Henriksen techs a question about the car. "What kind of question?" It was something about the battery housing, a grounding component." Marcus was keeping pace with her now, slightly behind, the way he always positioned himself when delivering information he wasn't confident about. Forsyth's team laughed at him. Vivian pushed open the door to the service corridor. "As they should," she said. "A delivery driver isn't going to solve what 16 specialists couldn't. He's still here. He's waiting to get a signature on the delivery manifest." "Then get him a signature." The service bay smelled the way it always did, oil and composite and the faint chemical underlayer of cleaning solvents. And it was full, as it always was now, of expensive equipment and expensive people standing around a car that none of them could fix. She counted them as she walked in. 12 today. Forsyth was at his station, reviewing something on his laptop with the focus of a man doing important work, or the performance of one. The two Molsheim engineers were talking quietly near the rear of the car, their coffee cups suggesting they'd been there for a while. The others were distributed around the bay in the particular pattern of people waiting for something to happen that none of them could make happen. The Chiron itself sat in the center of everything. It was, even inert, even surrounded by equipment and frustrated specialists, and the wreckage of 10 days of failure, genuinely beautiful. The nocturne blue caught the overhead lights in that specific way that Bugatti's paint department achieved with a combination of pigment layers and clear coat application that was still technically proprietary. It looked like a car that was barely containing something. Like stillness was a temporary condition and movement was its natural state. Except it wouldn't move, wouldn't start, wouldn't so much as flicker an interior light. "Good morning," she said, and nobody jumped, but everyone straightened slightly in the way they did when she entered a room, the specific posture adjustment of people who were aware of being observed by someone whose opinion had financial consequences. Forsyth turned from his laptop. "Ms. Hawthorne, I was just reviewing last night's—" "I'll hear the update in a moment." She moved to the front of the car and stood there for a beat, looking at it. "Where's the delivery driver?" There was a shift in the room, small, barely perceptible, the kind of shift that happened when something was about to be quietly embarrassing. One of the junior Henriksen technicians, a young woman named Serena, who Vivian had come to think of as the most competent person in the room, precisely because she never spoke unless she had something specific to say, gestured toward the side of the bay. "He's over by the parts station, ma'am, waiting for the manifest." Vivian turned. He was standing near the far wall, next to the rolling rack where the incoming delivery had been staged. He was wearing a jacket that had probably been dark blue at some point, and was now the uncertain color of something washed too many times. Work pants, boots that were clean but old. He was holding a clipboard with paperwork attached, and he was looking at the Chiron. Not the way the specialists looked at it, not the scanning, systematic look of people running diagnostics in their heads. He was looking at it the way someone looked at something they recognized, something familiar. He was 30-something, she guessed. Dark hair cut simply. The build of someone who worked with his hands. Not gym built, but the kind of physical fitness that came from actual use. There was something in his posture that didn't fit the picture. He wasn't deferential. He wasn't performing discomfort at being somewhere he didn't belong. He was simply standing there, looking at the car with the relaxed attention of someone waiting for a bus. His eyes moved to hers when she looked at him. "You're the one who had a question," she said. Something crossed his face. Not embarrassment, more like recalibration. It wasn't really a question, he said, more of an observation. Tell me. From her peripheral vision, she saw Forsyth shift, heard the faint sound of someone clearing their throat. The room's collective discomfort was palpable, and she didn't care about it. The man with the clipboard looked at her for a moment, then at the car, then back at her. Has anyone checked the hidden grounding bridge beneath the rear battery housing? The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Forsyth laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, which would have been easier to work with. It was the laugh of someone who had just heard something that confirmed what they already believed about the situation. A laugh of tired, expert amusement. 2 of the other specialists joined it. One of them said something in German that she didn't catch, and the other one nodded. The man with the clipboard didn't change expression. He looked at the floor for a second, then back at the car. I apologize for the interruption, he said, and moved toward the door. Wait. He stopped. Vivian was aware of Forsyth behind her, aware of the entire room, aware of the coverage and the comment sections and the $700,000 and the 10 days. She was also aware of something that had nothing to do with any of that, some operational instinct that she'd learned to trust over 9 years of building something from nothing. The man hadn't flinched when they laughed at him. He hadn't gotten defensive or explained himself or tried to earn the room's respect. He'd simply said what he had to say, been dismissed, and started to leave. Without resentment. Without performance. That was a particular kind of confidence. She'd only seen it in people who had nothing to prove because they'd already proven it somewhere else. What did you mean, she said, when you said the car wasn't broken? He turned back. He was looking at her with the careful attention of someone deciding whether a conversation was worth having. I said it's waiting, he said. There's a difference. Explain the difference. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was measured in the way of someone who was used to technical language but had learned to translate it. A broken car has failed. Something has degraded, worn out, cracked, burned. A car that's waiting has a fault, usually something small, something that interrupts a sequence. And it's doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is refuse to run rather than run wrong. The Chiron's self-protection protocols are extremely sophisticated. If it's not starting and there's no fault code, it's not broken. It found something wrong, and it stopped. She stared at him. Your specialists have been trying to diagnose a failure, he said, but there's no failure to diagnose. There's a condition the car recognized that the diagnostic software wasn't built to detect, so you keep getting clean readings on a car that won't run. Forsyth stepped forward. I appreciate the mechanic's perspective, but the Chiron's diagnostic systems are the most comprehensive in the consumer automotive industry. If there were a fault, we would have... The grounding bridge beneath the rear battery housing is a secondary redundancy component, the man said. He wasn't looking at Forsyth. He was still looking at Vivian. It was added in the Chiron production process after a series of electrical cascade issues in the prototype phase. It's not in the public service documentation. Most Bugatti certified technicians don't know it exists. The OBD2 port doesn't read it. The factory diagnostic laptop doesn't check it by default. If that bridge develops a fault, particularly a cold weather conductive fault that closes when the car is inactive for more than a few weeks, the car registers it as a baseline electrical anomaly and refuses to initialize. 0 error codes, 0 diagnostic flags, just silence. The bay was completely quiet. Forsyth's mouth was slightly open. He closed it. 5 minutes, Vivian said. Sorry? You have 5 minutes. She glanced at Marcus, who was standing near the door. Marcus, give him whatever he needs. Matt. His name was Mason Ryder, and his daughter was sitting in his truck. This was the thing Vivian learned in the next 4 minutes, while Marcus was getting Mason what he'd asked for. A flashlight, a multimeter, and unobstructed access to the rear service compartment from a junior technician named Carl, who kept looking at Mason the way you looked at someone doing something you were certain was wrong. She'd walked out to the parking area beside the service bay because she needed a moment away from the room, from the weight of 16 specialists and $700,000 and 10 days of failure. And she'd found herself standing beside a pickup truck that had probably been a certain shade of silver at the factory and was now more of a suggestion of silver, the kind of truck that accumulated its character through use rather than care. In the passenger seat, curled with the specific economy of children falling asleep in vehicles, was a girl. 8 years old, maybe. 9. She was wearing a striped sweater and had dark hair that fell across her face in the way of someone asleep in a position they'd chosen themselves rather than been placed in. There was a small lunch box on the seat beside her, and a backpack wedged against the door that had a cartoon of something. She couldn't tell what, exactly. Some kind of colorful animal, stitched onto the front. Marcus had appeared beside her, also looking at the truck. His daughter, Marcus said. She rides with him on school breaks, apparently. He drops her at school when he does the deliveries before school most days. He runs the company himself, as far as I can tell. Small operation. He sources specialty parts for independent shops, makes local deliveries. He's been supplying a few of our secondary vendors for about 2 years. She looked at the truck for another moment. Then she went back inside. Mason had already removed his jacket by the time she returned. He'd set the flashlight on the trunk lid of the Chiron, not on it, she noted, on the lip of the open engine compartment behind the main deck, and was looking at something with a focus that she recognized from the people who were genuinely good at what they did, a quality of attention that wasn't performative. The rear service access panel is on the passenger side, Forsyth said from across the bay. He'd been unable to leave entirely. None of them had. They'd all withdrawn to the periphery, arms crossed, with the posture of people maintaining professional dignity while watching something they couldn't look away from. I know where it is, Mason said. He found it in approximately 8 seconds. Not because he searched for it, because he went directly to it, the way you went directly to a light switch in a room you'd lived in before. The panel was small, roughly the size of a paperback book, positioned beneath the main battery housing in a recessed cavity that was essentially invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. It didn't appear in any of the service materials that Forsyth's team had been working from. He opened it with a thumbnail. He clicked on the flashlight and held it at a low angle, the way you lit something when you were looking for a surface irregularity rather than trying to illuminate it. Then he took the multimeter, the cheap kind, the kind that cost $30 rather than $300, and positioned the probes. The reading came back in about 15 seconds. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached into the worn canvas tool bag he'd brought in with him and came out with a short piece of wire. Not a specialty component, not a replacement part from a sealed factory case. A piece of wire. Vivienne watched him work for the next 3 minutes and didn't say anything. Nobody said anything. The bay was quiet in a way it hadn't been in 10 days. Not the silence of people waiting for results, but the silence of people watching something they weren't sure they understood. Mason's hands were steady. He worked with the economy of movement of someone who had done similar work many times, not on this specific car, but in this specific type of situation, the kind where the answer wasn't in the documentation, and you had to find it with your hands and your knowledge of how things were actually built rather than how they were documented as being built. He made the connection. He withdrew his hands from the cavity. He closed the access panel with his thumbnail. He stood up. "Try it now," he said. Marcus had the key fob. He looked at Vivienne. She nodded once. Marcus pressed the button. The sound came up from somewhere beneath the floor and the hood and the entire composite structure of the car, a sound that was not a start in the ordinary mechanical sense, but more like a system waking. Electronics first, the hiss and whisper of systems initializing, then the fuel delivery priming, then the ignition sequence, and then, at the end of all of it, the engine. 16 cylinders, 8 liters, 1,500 horsepower. The sound filled the bay completely, bouncing off the concrete floor and the steel ceiling and the glass of the observation windows. And it was not a small sound. It was the sound of something that had been very expensive to build and that had been designed to announce itself when it ran. And it did. The Bugatti was alive. Vivienne stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at Mason, who was putting the multimeter back in his canvas bag with the same methodical lack of drama he'd brought to the entire previous 20 minutes. She looked at Forsyth, who was standing at the edge of the bay with an expression she'd never seen on his face before, not quite understanding it yet. The understanding was coming. She could see it arriving in stages, but he wasn't there yet. She looked at the car. The 16-cylinder engine settled into its idle, a deep, composed, almost conversational rumble, And the telemetry display lit the interior, and the parking lights came on automatically as the systems finished their initialization sequence, washing the front of the bay in amber. 10 days. $700,000. 4 minutes. She turned back to Mason, who had zipped the canvas bag and straightened up, and was looking at the car with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not satisfaction exactly, not pride. Something quieter than either of those. Something that looked like recognition, like greeting something you'd missed. "How?" she said, and stopped, and started again. "How did you know it was the grounding bridge?" He looked at her, then at the car, then back at her. "The cold weather pattern," he said. "Your car has been in storage since February. The diagnostic team's initial call was in the middle of March. That's a 6-week exposure window in a climate-controlled space, which means temperature variation between night cycle and day cycle conditions, even with the climate control. The conductive fault on that specific component type requires a certain temperature differential over a sustained period to develop. It's not a component that fails in warm or consistent conditions. It closes when the metal contracts." He paused. "The other thing was the silence. No codes, no flags. The Chiron's protection protocols are designed to be quiet about certain failure types because they're designed to prevent the car from being operated incorrectly by someone who doesn't understand what they're seeing. If you get a code, most people will try to clear it and drive anyway. If you get silence, you can't. So you recognize the pattern." "I recognize the car," he said simply. She looked at him for a moment. "That's not something you learn doing parts deliveries." His expression shifted slightly. "Not much." "No," he said. "It's not." The engine continued to idle behind her, deep and steady and alive. "I think," Vivian said, "you should come inside." He glanced toward the parking area. "My daughter, Marcus, will make sure she's comfortable. We have a break room that's— She doesn't wake up well in unfamiliar places," he said. It wasn't apologetic. It was just information, the information of a man who had arranged his life around a particular set of priorities. "Then we can talk here," Vivian said. "I want to know who you actually are." The engine rumbled behind her. Mason looked at it for a moment, and she saw that expression again. The quiet one, the one she couldn't name. And then he looked at her. "That might take a little while," he said. "I have time," she said. And she did. For the first time in 10 days, with the sound of $17 million running smoothly 6 feet away, she genuinely had time. What followed was not a formal conversation. There was no conference table, no assistant taking notes, no carefully managed corporate debrief of the kind Vivian usually conducted when she was acquiring information she intended to use. She was standing in a service bay next to a running hypercar, and a man with a canvas tool bag and worn boots. And the conversation that developed between them had the specific quality of two people talking plainly, because neither of them had anything to perform. Forsyth and his team had filtered out in small groups over the previous few minutes. She'd registered their departures without marking them. Marcus had stayed, positioned near the door the way he always positioned himself when he thought he might be needed. And she let him stay because Marcus's presence was usually neutral enough to not matter. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Of what?" "Of how you know what you know about a car you've never worked on." He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much to say rather than how to say it. "I used to work in hypersport development," he said. "Electrical systems. Not for Bugatti specifically, but for two companies that were doing similar work in the same era. Late-stage development, pre-production testing, some prototype work." He looked at the Chiron. The grounding bridge design was an industry-wide response to a specific problem that came up in multiple development programs around the same time. It was handled differently by different engineers, but the underlying logic was the same. I knew it existed in this platform because I worked on a different platform that solved the same problem the same way. "Which companies?" He named them. She knew them both. One had been acquired by a European conglomerate 6 years ago. The other still existed, still produced a handful of extremely expensive cars each year, still occupied the specific tier of automotive mythology where engineering and scarcity became art. "You were at that level," she said. It wasn't a question. "For a while." "And then?" The brief thing that happened in his expression was not grief exactly. It was the way people looked when they were talking about something they'd made their peace with, but that still had weight. "My wife died," he said, "about 4 years ago. Embolism. She was fine, and then she wasn't, and then 3 days later she was gone." He said this with the directness of someone who had learned that directness was easier than softening it. "Our daughter was 4. I was traveling constantly. Development work requires that. And I couldn't keep doing that and be what Lily needed. So I stopped and opened a parts shop. Eventually, first I was just home for a while." He paused. "That sounds simple. It wasn't. But that's what I needed to do, so that's what I did." She thought about her own life, the years of building, the particular mathematics of what you gained and what you gave up to gain it. She thought about the coffee she'd been carrying all morning that she still hadn't drunk. "You gave up a career to be home," she said. "I gave up a career to be her dad," he said, "which is a different thing. Being home is a circumstance. Being her dad is what I'm actually doing." Marcus made a sound near the door. She didn't look at him. "The shop works out?" she asked. "It works. We're comfortable. I pick her up from school every afternoon. We have dinner together. She does her homework. On weekends, we sometimes work in the shop together. She likes handing me things. She has opinions about which wrench is which is mostly wrong, but I haven't corrected her yet." Something in his face that was almost a smile. "We're okay." "But you could fix a $17 million car with a piece of wire," she said. "The wire was a temporary bridge," he said, with the slight corrective tone of someone who is careful about precision. "The actual repair needs a proper replacement component. I can source one by tomorrow. The bridge holds for now, but it's not—" "I know," she said. "I meant it differently." She looked at him. "You walked away from that." "I walked toward something else," he said. She stood with that for a moment. The engine idled. She thought about the $700,000 and the 16 specialists and the 10 days and the comment sections and the YouTube video and the trade press item. She thought about the 2 Molsheim engineers who had flown in with factory documentation and a sealed case of components and still couldn't find what a man in a worn jacket had found in 4 minutes with a $30 multimeter. She thought about this fact that she'd almost had him escorted out. "You weren't going to say anything," she said. "When Forsyth laughed at you, you were just going to leave." "I did leave," he said. "You called me back. But before that—" He was quiet for a moment. "It's not my car," he said. "It's not my problem. I was there to deliver parts." He paused. "But I watched those guys for about 2 minutes while I was waiting for the manifest. And you can tell when you know what you're looking for. They were running diagnostics on a car that wasn't giving them anything to diagnose. They were looking at data on screens instead of looking at the car. And the car," he glanced at it, "was just sitting there telling them everything they needed to know, and nobody was listening to it." "How do you listen to a car?" "Same way you listen to anything," he said. "You stop trying to hear what you expect to hear." He did. They stayed in the bay for another 20 minutes after that, the conversation drifting the way conversations did when the pressure had been released from them. She asked him about the specific technical history of the grounding bridge component. He explained it with the patience of someone who had explained technical things to non-technical people enough times to know how to do it without condescension, which was its own skill. She asked about his shop. He described it in the sparse way of someone who didn't need other people's admiration to feel good about their choices. At one point, Marcus appeared at her elbow and said quietly that Mason's daughter had woken up in the truck and that one of the front office staff had brought her inside, and she was in the break room with a juice box and what appeared to be a significant quantity of opinions about the vending machine selection. Mason's expression shifted entirely. It wasn't alarm exactly. It was the specific recalibration of a person whose center of gravity is somewhere outside themselves. "She okay?" "She seems fine," Marcus said. She asked one of the receptionists if we had anything with chocolate that wasn't in a wrapper with a yellow background. Apparently she doesn't trust yellow wrappers. Mason's face did the thing that was almost a smile again, except this time it completed itself. It was a real smile, the kind that arrived from somewhere rather than being produced, and it changed his face enough that she understood something she hadn't fully understood before, which was that the composure he'd been carrying since he walked in the door was not detachment. It was the composure of someone who had something to protect and had learned to protect it by being steady. "I should go get her," he said. "Of course." She paused. "Mr. Ryder, Mason, I want to—" She stopped. Arranged the next sentence. "I'd like to talk with you again. Not today, but soon. I have a proposal I want to think through before I present it." He looked at her with the same careful attention he'd given to the multimeter readout. "A proposal. I run a large organization," she said. "I have engineers, I have diagnostic departments, I have specialists on 3 continents." She looked at the Bugatti, still running, steady and alive and filling the bay with its even, powerful idol. "And I spent 10 days and $700,000 to learn that the person who could solve the problem was making a parts delivery." She looked back at him. "That's a structural problem, and I don't like structural problems." He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of proposal?" "The kind that would let you pick your daughter up from school every afternoon," she said. "If you're interested." She watched him absorb this. It wasn't the expression of someone calculating an offer. It was the expression of someone whose suspicion of things that sounded too easy was deeply ingrained. The expression of someone who had learned that the world mostly offered things with conditions that looked different from the front than they did once you got inside them. "I'm not saying yes," he said. "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I'm asking you to have a conversation." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded once, the nod of someone who was not committing to anything, but was not closing a door. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said, "with the replacement component for the bridge. We can talk then." He picked up his canvas bag. He walked toward the break room. Vivienne stood in the service bay with the Bugatti idling beside her and thought about the past 10 days, the specialists and the equipment and the coverage and the money and the weight of it, and thought about the 4 minutes and the $30 multimeter and the piece of wire. She thought about what he'd said. You stop trying to hear what you expect to hear. She picked up the coffee she'd been carrying all morning. It was cold. It had been cold for 2 hours. She drank it anyway. He came back the next morning at 7:43. Vivienne knew this because Marcus told her, and Marcus told her because he'd been watching for it, which she'd asked him to do without explicitly saying so. The kind of instruction she gave with tone rather than words, which Marcus had learned to read over 4 years of working for her. The truck pulled into the service bay lot, and Mason got out alone this time, which meant Lily was at school, which meant it was a regular delivery day that had been converted into something else. And Vivienne noticed that she registered this detail before she registered most of the other things she was supposed to be paying attention to that morning. She was in the middle of a call with her CFO about Q2 projections when Marcus knocked once and held up 2 fingers, the signal they developed for things that needed her attention in under 10 minutes. She wrapped the call in 4, which her CFO took with the practiced equanimity of a man who had worked with her long enough to know that her interruptions were usually worth it. Mason was in the service bay alone except for Carl, the junior technician who'd been assigned to maintain the space after the specialist departed. He was standing at the rear of the Chiron with his canvas bag open on the floor beside him, not yet working, looking at the car with that particular quality of attention she'd noticed the day before, the quality of looking rather than scanning, of seeing rather than reading. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her. "You're early," she said. He turned. He was wearing a different jacket today, same category as yesterday's, dark, unremarkable, the jacket of someone who worked outside in variable weather and needed function rather than presentation. "I had another delivery in the building next block. Figured I'd come straight here after." "Did you get coffee?" "No." "Marcus," she said, and Marcus, who had materialized behind her with the quiet reliability that was his defining professional quality, nodded and disappeared. She walked into the bay and stopped a few feet from Mason, looking at the Chiron. In the morning light, the nocturne blue had a different quality than it did under the overhead work lights. Deeper, more interior, the blue of something you saw in peripheral vision and then looked directly at and found had shifted. "The car ran last night," she said, "after you left. Marcus took it around the private lot. He said it felt like nothing had been wrong." "The bridge connection holds cleanly once it's corrected," Mason said. "Cold cycling is what causes the fault. Once the contact is remade, the car resets its baseline and behaves normally." Until the next cold cycle. Until the next cold cycle, he confirmed, which is why you need the permanent component. He was already moving to the rear housing, the access panel, which he found with the same direct efficiency as the day before. She watched him work for a few minutes, not hovering. She positioned herself near the front of the car, giving him space, because she'd learned early that watching someone work from too close was a form of pressure that produced worse results for most people. Mason wasn't most people. She was already fairly sure of that, but she gave him the space anyway. Marcus came back with 2 coffees in mugs rather than paper cups, which meant he'd used the executive kitchen rather than the break room machine. He set one near Mason's bag and one near Vivian's hand and left without speaking. Mason glanced at the mug without breaking his work rhythm. "Thank you," he said, to the general space, which was the most efficient way to thank someone who wasn't there. "He heard you," she said. "I figured." She drank her coffee, which was the temperature coffee was supposed to be, which was a significant improvement over yesterday. She watched the morning light shift across the Chiron's hood and thought about what she'd been thinking about since 6:15 when she'd woken up, which was less a specific thought and more a problem she was assembling from its components. The $700,000 bothered her less than it had. Money of that magnitude was not nothing, but it was within the operational tolerance of an organization her size, and she had good accounting reasons to categorize it as a diagnostic investment rather than a loss. What bothered her was the architecture of how it had happened. 16 specialists, 10 days. An answer that took 4 minutes and a $30 multimeter. Not because the specialists were incompetent. Forsyth was genuinely good at what he did, and the Molsheim engineers understood their platform at a level most people never achieved. But the gap between what all of that expertise had produced and what one man with worn boots had produced in under 5 minutes was not a gap she could explain away. It was structural. It was a problem in how expertise worked or failed to work when it stopped being connected to the thing it was supposed to know. She was still assembling that problem when Mason said, without looking up from the housing, "You're trying to figure out how to frame this." She looked at him. Frame what? The offer. He was working with a precision tool, not one of hers, his own, from the canvas bag. "You said you had a proposal. You've been quiet for the past 8 minutes in the way people are quiet when they're organizing something in their head, rather than just being comfortable with silence." She considered denying this and then decided it wasn't worth the energy. "I've been thinking about what problem I'm actually trying to solve," she said, "before I can frame the offer." He glanced up at her, glanced back down. "And?" "I'm still assembling it." He made a sound that was close to a laugh, but not quite. "Fair enough." She waited. He finished seating the replacement component, ran the test connection, held the multimeter probes in place, and read the values. He was quiet while he did this, the specific quiet of someone executing a process that required their full attention. She didn't interrupt it. "Okay," he said finally, and withdrew his hands and closed the panel. He stood, picked up his coffee, and drank it. She noticed he drank it black, the way people did when coffee was fuel rather than ritual. "Try it," he said. Marcus must have been watching from somewhere because he appeared within 15 seconds with the key fob. He pressed the button. The Chiron systems initialized. The same sequence as yesterday, electronics first, then fuel, then ignition. And the engine came up with the same authority, the same bay-filling rumble that was less a sound than a pressure you felt in the center of your chest. "That's permanent now," Mason said. "You can drive it." She nodded. "Thank you." He finished his coffee, set the mug down, began repacking his bag. There was a quality to this. The packing up, the methodical restoration of his tools to their places in the bag, that suggested he was used to finishing a job and moving to the next one without ceremony, used to the completion of things not being marked. "I want to talk about the proposal now," she said. He straightened up. "All right." They moved out of the bay into the small conference room adjacent to the executive suite. Not the main conference room, which had a long table and video screens and the explicit architecture of formal meetings, but the smaller one, the one she used for conversations she wanted to feel less like transactions. Marcus brought more coffee and a plate of something from the kitchen that she didn't register and didn't eat. Mason didn't eat either, but he took a second coffee, which she counted as a small positive signal. She'd been thinking about how to say this for 12 hours and had arrived at the conclusion that the best way was directly. I want to build something new, she said, within Hawthorne. A division, small, focused, dedicated to solving problems that our existing diagnostic capabilities can't handle, which yesterday would have meant problems our equipment can't detect. But that's not actually the problem. The problem is that we've built every diagnostic system around what's in the documentation, and the documentation doesn't know everything. It knows what was designed. It doesn't know how things actually behave over time, in conditions, in the gap between what was engineered and what's actually happening in a specific car. She could see him listening. He had the listening quality of someone who was tracking not just what was being said, but what was being implied. I also want to pair that with something else, she said. We have young mechanics coming up through our service centers. Good people, technically solid, who are being trained entirely on equipment and software and documentation. The same limitations we just spent 10 days bumping into. I want someone who can work with them the way good knowledge actually transfers, person to person, through problems and practice. Not a training program, not a curriculum. Someone who works alongside them and teaches by doing. She stopped. That's not one job, he said. That's two. It's one role, she said. The diagnostics work and the mentorship work are the same skill applied in two directions. You'd be doing both simultaneously. He was looking at the table between them, not avoiding her eyes, just thinking. And the management structure? You'd report to me. He looked up. Directly. Directly. Why? Because what you'd be doing wouldn't fit any existing category in my organization, she said. And when something doesn't fit existing categories, the worst thing you can do is put it under someone who's going to try to make it fit. That kills the thing. He was quiet. She could see him turning this over. How many people? He asked. To start with, I want it small. You, 2 or 3 mechanics you'd select yourself. Junior to mid-level, people who have the instinct but haven't had the mentorship, and a logistics coordinator. If it works the way I think it can work, it grows organically. If it doesn't work, it stays small and costs me less than yesterday did. That last part was honest in a way that she thought might land better than a pitch would, and she saw in his expression that it had. What's the hours structure? He said. Whatever you need, outcome focused. I don't care when you work, I care what gets solved. He looked at her steadily. I pick up Lily at 3:15. I know. Every day, not most days, every day. I heard you, she said. I'm not negotiating that condition. It's not a condition I'm willing to negotiate. He watched her face for a moment, the specific watching of someone checking whether a promise and a face match. She held it because she meant it, and because she'd learned that looking away from this kind of check read as uncertainty even when it wasn't. You said you wanted to think about the framing before you made the proposal, he said. What did you land on? What problem are you actually solving? She considered this. I spent 10 days and $700,000 because I trusted expensive over experienced, she said. And I'm not sure that's just a personal mistake. I think that's a structural problem in how the industry treats expertise. Credentials over pattern recognition. Documentation over direct knowledge. The things that are hardest to measure are the things that are most valuable when you actually need them. And I'd rather build something inside this organization that acknowledges that than keep pretending the diagnostic software has it handled. He was quiet for a long moment. There's something you should know, he said. Tell me. He put his coffee down. I left that world for reasons that aren't just about Lily. Or they are about Lily, but in a more specific way than I said yesterday. He looked at his hands for a second, the look of someone deciding the shape of something before they said it. When Claire died, I was in Stuttgart for a systems review on a prototype that wasn't going to launch for 2 more years. I got the call at 2 in the morning. She'd been admitted the previous afternoon with symptoms they were treating as a respiratory issue. By the time they understood what it actually was, the window was already closing. I got home 18 hours later. She died 4 hours after I got there. Vivienne was very still. Lily was with my mother-in-law, he said. She was 4. She doesn't have a clear memory of those days, which I've decided is something I'm going to let be what it is instead of trying to manage. He paused. The work I was doing was important to the people who were paying for it. It was not important in any other sense. And I had spent 3 years treating it like it was the most important thing, which meant I was somewhere else when I needed to be home. He paused again. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because if I take this, I need you to actually understand what it means that I leave at 3. It doesn't mean I'm not committed to the work. It means I'm not going to make the same calculation again. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the service bay was visible through the glass partition, the Chiron idling as Carl ran through the post-repair checklist, the car vivid and alive under the LED wash. I understand, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going to pretend I know what that cost, she said, but I understand what you're telling me about the condition, and I'm not asking you to compromise it. He was quiet for another few seconds. Then he nodded once. I'm not saying yes yet, he said. You said that yesterday too. I mean it both times. What else do you need? He looked at the table, then at her. I want to meet the mechanics you're thinking about before I decide. I want to see who you're putting in the room. That's reasonable, she said, and I want to be the one who decides what constitutes a solvable problem, not a committee, not a list of priority vehicles from the marketing department. If I think something is worth working on, I work on it. If I think we're being asked to spend time on something that doesn't serve the actual diagnostic mission, I say so. Also reasonable. And I need to be able to tell the mechanics the truth about what we're doing, including the parts that don't make the organization look good. He met her eyes. Which means if we're building this, I'm not running cover for failures. If we find something that's a systematic problem across the service centers, I say so. To you, directly. You can decide what to do with it, but I'm not managing the information. She looked at him. I'd expect nothing less. You say that now. I do say that now. I mean it. She paused. I didn't get where I am by surrounding myself with people who manage my information. The ones who did that never lasted. What I need around me are people who tell me what's actually true because I can work with true. What I can't work with is a cleaned up version of true that protects someone's comfort. He studied her face again in that way he had, that checking quality. Okay, he said. Okay, meaning I'll come back. I want to see the facility you're thinking about. I want to meet the people. He picked up his canvas bag. I'm not making a decision in a conference room. I make decisions in the actual space. She felt something she recognized from the moments in her professional life when a negotiation had moved into territory that was going to produce a real outcome rather than a polite stall. It was not quite certainty. It was more like productive uncertainty, the kind that meant something was alive. When? She said. Friday, he said. I have deliveries in the morning. I can come by after. I'll have Marcus set up access. He nodded. He was moving toward the door when he stopped, not turning around fully. The Chiron, he said. What about it? He turned enough that she could see his profile. That's a car that deserves to be driven, not stored. If you're going to keep it in climate-controlled storage for 6 weeks at a time, you should have someone cycle it, drive it, warm it up, run it through its range. Otherwise, you'll keep getting cold cycle faults on components that aren't designed for extended stasis. She thought about this. Is that a professional recommendation? It's a practical one. A pause. It's a car, not an artifact. It runs better when it's used. He went out. Marcus came in 3 minutes later, which was about how long it took him to materialize after Mason left any room, and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone who had observations but was waiting to be invited to share them. He's going to say yes, Marcus said. He's going to think about it, she said. Those are different things. He's going to think about it and then say yes. She looked at him. What makes you confident? Marcus considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Because he asked what the hours structure was before he asked what the salary was, he said. He asked about the mechanics before he asked about the resources. He asked what he was allowed to say before he asked what he was expected to produce. He paused. Those are the questions of someone who's deciding whether the work is real, not someone who's deciding whether it's worth his time financially. He's already past the financial question. She thought about this. What was he paid in his previous work? Do we know? Not precisely. I looked into it last night. Marcus had the carefully neutral expression he adopted when he'd done something she'd implied but not explicitly requested. At his level, in that sector, at that time, we're probably talking north of 300,000, possibly significantly north, depending on the specifics of the role. She looked at the table where Mason's second coffee mug was still sitting, still faintly steaming. "And he's running a parts delivery service," she said. "He's running a parts delivery service that lets him pick up his daughter from school every afternoon," Marcus said, "which is a different thing." She looked at him. It was not the first time Marcus had surprised her, but it was a particular kind of surprise, the kind that came from someone saying something she'd been thinking but hadn't articulated yet. She'd hired Marcus partly for that quality, the ability to surface what was present in a room without being asked, and he delivered it with the same reliability he brought to everything else. It was occasionally disarming. "Set up the facility access for Friday," she said, "and pull together a list of the junior mechanics you think are most promising from the Stanford and Greenwich centers. 3 or 4 names. Don't filter for anything except genuine aptitude, not credentials, not performance metrics from the standard evaluations. Actual aptitude. Talk to their supervisors and ask specifically about the ones who solve problems their training didn't prepare them for." "I know what to look for," Marcus said. "I know you do." She paused. "And Marcus, the specialists, Forsyth's group, the Molsheim engineers. Make sure the departure process is handled well, contracts honored, thank you notes, references available if needed. I don't want anyone leaving this feeling like, 'It's already done,'" Marcus said. She looked at him. "I handled it this morning," he said, "before you were up." She stared at him for a moment. "What time did you get here?" 5:30, he said. "You were already up." "I was on email." "I know. You sent me 3 of them between 4:45 and 5:20. He said this without accusation, just documentation. "I had the departure process completed by 6:15. She looked at the window. At the Chiron in the bay, finally still, Carl having finished the checklist and powered it down, the car sitting in its own quiet the way it always had. Except that now it was a different kind of quiet. The quiet of something resting rather than the silence of something wrong. She thought about Mason's hands on the access panel, the $30 multimeter, the piece of wire. She thought about what he'd said about his wife, the specific shape of how he'd told it. Direct, without armor, but without theater either. The kind of honesty that costs something. She thought about the canvas bag and the worn jacket and the little girl who had opinions about vending machine wrappers. She thought about something she didn't have a name for yet, some new configuration of things she'd been carrying for a long time that seemed, this morning, to be arranging itself into a different shape. Not a better shape necessarily. Just different. More accurate to something she couldn't quite see yet. "I'll be in my office," she said. "I know," Marcus said. The thing about building something for 9 years was that you accumulated a particular kind of clarity about what you were actually good at and what you only thought you were good at. And if you were honest with yourself, which she tried to be with varying success on a daily basis, those 2 categories turned out to be different sizes than you'd expected. She was good at reading people. She was good at seeing the structural properties of a problem before she could articulate them. She was good at the particular kind of patience that allowed her to hold something unresolved without forcing a resolution prematurely. And she was good at knowing when she was in the presence of something real, as opposed to something that performed being real, which was a distinction that mattered in every significant decision she'd ever made. She was less good at admitting when she'd made a significant error. Not in private. In private, she was direct about her failures, almost to a fault. She dissected them, turned them over, extracted whatever structural lesson was available, and applied it. What she found harder was the kind of admission that happened in front of other people, the kind that required lowering something she'd been holding up. The 10 days and $700,000 were, in retrospect, partly a consequence of this. She'd kept the specialist longer than she should have because admitting that the expensive option wasn't working meant admitting she'd chosen the expensive option when it wasn't warranted. She'd been thinking about this since last night. Not with self-flagellation, which she'd never found useful, but with the specific attention she tried to give to patterns she wanted to change. She was still thinking about it on Friday morning when her assistant told her Mason had arrived. He was already in the proposed facility space when she got there, a large service area on the eastern end of the main service complex that had been used for storage and was currently being cleared out. Not at her instruction, but at Marcus's, who had apparently decided the clearing needed to happen before Friday, regardless of any formal decision. She made a note to address this tendency with him, and then decided she probably wouldn't. Mason was standing in the center of the empty space, hands in his jacket pockets, turning slowly. The space was large, but say, about 30 feet by 50, with high ceilings, excellent overhead lighting from the skylights Marcus had already cleaned, and a concrete floor that was worn in the specific patterns that marked years of good use. There were 4 service bays indicated by the drain positions in the floor. Along one wall, the utility connections for compressed air and power were already in place. Along the opposite wall, the built-in cabinetry was solid, if old, the kind of construction that didn't happen anymore. He turned when she came in, and she saw that his expression had something new in it, something closer to interest than anything she'd seen on his face before. He was looking at the space the way he'd looked at the Chiron, with the quality of someone who was seeing what something could be rather than what it currently was. "Marcus cleared the storage," she said, "without my asking." "Good call," Mason said. "He has a habit of doing things before I ask." "You should probably keep him." She looked at him. "Walk me through what you're seeing." He turned back to the space. 4 bays is more than I need to start. 2 is fine. Maybe 3 eventually. The ceiling height is good. You can get a proper lift in here without feeling like the car is going to come through the roof, which matters more than people think for the mechanics who are working underneath. He moved toward the far wall. "The cabinets are better than anything you'd buy new. This is solid wood construction under the laminate. You'd want to refit the hardware and the drawer slides, but the boxes are built right." He knocked on the frame. "See? I'll take your word for it." He moved to the center of the space. "The light is good. The skylight placement is smart. You get natural light on the work surface without direct sun on the diagnostic area, which reduces screen glare and heat buildup. Someone planned this room correctly." He paused. "The utility connections are everything you need. You won't have to run new lines." "What would you need added?" "A workbench along the north wall. Not prefabricated, custom, built to a specific height and depth for working with precision components." "Better than the standard. An air temperature management system that can be set independently from the main building HVAC, because electrical diagnostics are sensitive to ambient temperature variation in ways that most service environments don't account for." He paused. "A whiteboard." She looked at him. "A whiteboard? I know that sounds—" "No," she said. "It sounds right. What else?" "Nothing expensive. Not yet. If the work expands, the needs will become clearer. Starting with less forces you to think. Starting with more encourages you to reach for the equipment instead of the problem." She absorbed this. "I want you to meet 3 people before you leave today." He turned to her. 2 mechanics from the Stamford Center, 1 from Greenwich," she said. "Marcus pulled the names this week. I've reviewed their records. They're young. One of them is 22, and their credentials are not particularly impressive on paper. What's impressive about them, apparently, is that when their supervisors run out of answers, these 3 people keep looking." Mason was quiet for a moment. "How long will they be here?" "As long as you need. I've cleared their schedules for the afternoon." He nodded. "Okay." She looked at him. "Is there anything about this you want to say no to?" He looked around the space again, then back at her. "I'm going to say yes," he said. She waited. "But I need you to understand something about how this works," he said. "Whatever gets built here, it won't look like what you're imagining. It never does. Real diagnostic work doesn't have a clean through line. It's messy and slow and wrong a lot before it's right, and the value of it doesn't show up on a quarterly report. It shows up 3 months later when a car gets correctly diagnosed the first time, or when one of these mechanics finds something a $100,000 scanner missed. That's hard to measure, which means someone is going to pressure you to measure it the wrong way eventually. I want to know how you'll handle that." She looked at him. "I'll tell them what I'm telling you," she said. "That the most expensive mistake I made recently cost $700,000 and 10 days, and it cost that because I was measuring the wrong thing. I measured credential over pattern recognition, cost of equipment over quality of attention. I'd rather lose the argument about quarterly metrics than make that mistake again." He held her gaze for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression, subtle, The same thing she'd seen in the service bay when he heard the engine come to life. That quiet recognition. "Okay," he said, "let's meet the mechanics." She led him toward the conference room where Marcus had staged the introductions. And as they crossed the threshold from the empty space into the corridor, she was aware of something settling. Not a conclusion, but a beginning taking shape. The specific feeling of something real starting, with all the uncertainty that came with real things, and none of the false smoothness of things that only performed being real. She didn't know exactly what she was building yet. She thought that was probably the right way to start. The three mechanics arrived within 10 minutes of each other, which Marcus had probably orchestrated, and they came into the conference room with the specific discomfort of people who had been told they were wanted somewhere without being told why. The first was Dominic Reyes, 22, from the Stanford Center. He was compact and dark-eyed, and had the slightly defensive posture of someone who had been underestimated recently and was braced for it to happen again. His file said he'd come up through a community college automotive program, which in the hierarchy of how Hawthorne's service centers assessed incoming mechanics, put him below the Technical Institute graduates and well below anyone with a 4-year engineering credential. What his file also said, in the supervisor notes Marcus had flagged, was that in the past 14 months, Dominic had correctly diagnosed 4 recurring electrical faults that the center's primary diagnostic software had failed to identify, on 2 separate makes, using methods his supervisor described as unconventional but consistently effective. The second was a woman named Priya Anand, 27, also from Stanford. She'd come from a different path, engineering degree, 2 years at a German manufacturer's American service division, then a lateral move to Hawthorne that her previous employer apparently hadn't understood, and she apparently hadn't explained. She was quiet in the way of someone who had learned to wait before speaking, and when she looked at Mason across the conference table, she did it with the direct attention of someone who was assessing rather than deferring. The third was an older man, 34, named Garrett Okafor, from the Greenwich Center. He was the one Vivian had been most uncertain about including. His performance reviews were inconsistent, his supervisor's notes ranged from exceptional instinct to doesn't follow protocol. And he had a documented incident from 8 months ago in which he'd spent 3 unscheduled hours on a client's Porsche Taycan that had already been cleared by the primary technician, found a software conflict that the clearance had missed, and then had to be corrected through channels for going outside his assigned scope. He'd received a formal reprimand for the incident. The car had been returned to the client without the conflict that would have, his supervisor privately acknowledged, caused a cascade fault within approximately 300 miles. Vivian watched Mason's face as he looked at the 3 of them across the table. He didn't introduce himself with a title or a history. He said his name and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone deciding where to begin, and then he said, "I'm going to ask each of you one question. I want you to answer it specifically. Not the answer you think I'm looking for. The actual answer. Ready?" Dominic nodded. Priya nodded. Garrett looked at his hands and then at Mason and said, "Yeah." Mason looked at Dominic first. "Tell me about the last time your diagnostic software gave you a clean reading on a car that you knew wasn't right." Dominic's jaw moved slightly. The look of someone recalibrating expectations. 6 weeks ago, he said. Aston Martin DB11. Full scan clean across every module. Client was complaining about intermittent power loss above 4,000 RPM. Not every time, just sometimes. The kind of thing that's easy to tell a client they imagined. He paused. "I didn't think they imagined it." "What did you do?" "I drove it. About 40 minutes, mixed road, pushed it through the RPM range maybe 12 times, 11 times nothing. 12th time I felt it. Just a hesitation, a quarter second, and then it corrected. So small you'd have to be paying attention." He paused. "It was a fuel injector pre-charge timing issue. Thermal expansion on a connector that only presented when the engine was fully heat-soaked and under load at a specific RPM band. Software never would have found it. You'd have to feel it." Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he moved to Priya. "Same question." 3 months ago, she said without hesitation. McLaren 720S clean scan. Client reported a steering response inconsistency at highway speed. Subtle, said it felt like the car was thinking for half a second before responding to input. She paused. The service software flagged nothing. The hydraulic systems checked clean. The electronic power steering module checked clean. Another pause, shorter. I went back to the original engineering specs from my time at the German division. Not McLaren specifically, but similar architecture. There's a cross-referencing behavior between the active chassis management system and the steering module that only triggers in specific combined conditions: speed, lateral G, road surface input. When all three are present simultaneously, there's a processing priority conflict that lasts about 400 milliseconds. She looked at the table, then at Mason. It's not in any service documentation. It was a known issue in the development phase of a similar platform that was resolved differently. I recognized the symptom. Mason nodded slowly. He looked at Garrett. Same question. Garrett was quiet for a moment longer than the others, not because he didn't have an answer, because he was deciding how much of the context to include. My clean scan story comes with a reprimand attached to it, he said. I know about the Taycan, Mason said. Garrett looked at him. Then you know the answer. Tell me anyway. Garrett looked at him for another beat, then, the car passed primary diagnostic, full software review, clean bill. My supervisor signed off. I was supposed to clean it up and stage it for client pickup. I was walking past it, and I noticed the thermal management display was cycling in a pattern I'd seen before. Not an error pattern, just a timing pattern on the cycling intervals that was 2 seconds longer than nominal. Not outside tolerance, just different from what I'd expect on a healthy system. He paused. I sat with it for a while. Went back through the diagnostic logs. Found a software interaction between two modules that was technically within parameter on each module individually, but when you looked at how they were talking to each other, he shook his head slightly. It was going to fail. Not that day, maybe not that week, but under sustained load at certain battery temperatures, it was going to produce a cascade shutdown. The client would have been on a highway. And you worked it without authorization, Mason said. I worked it because there wasn't time to go through channels and have a conversation and get approval and get it escalated and get someone to look at it who... He stopped. Yeah, I worked it without authorization. Would you do it again? The conference room was very quiet. Garrett looked at Mason directly. With respect to whoever's asking, if the situation was the same, yes, I would. Mason sat back slightly. He looked at all three of them. Then he looked at Vivian. These three, he said. Not a question. These three, she said. He looked back at the mechanics. I'm going to tell you what we're building, he said, and I want you to tell me if it's something you actually want to be part of, because I'm not interested in people who say yes, because they've been told to. What followed was not the meeting Vivian had envisioned when she'd imagined how this would go. She'd expected to observe, perhaps interject occasionally, let Mason lead, but maintain the framing of the conversation in the way she maintained the framing of most things in her organization. What actually happened was that Mason started talking, and she stopped being the person running the room and became the person listening to it, which hadn't happened to her in a significant meeting in longer than she could clearly remember. He explained what he was proposing, the division, the focus, the approach, in terms that were technical enough to communicate precision and plain enough to communicate respect for the people he was talking to. He didn't oversell it. He said directly that the work would be slow and would require genuine patience, that there would be problems they couldn't solve, and he wouldn't pretend otherwise, that the value of what they were doing was going to be difficult to explain to people who measured automotive service the way most organizations measured it. Dominic asked about the diagnostic equipment they'd have access to. Some of it, Mason said, the basic high-quality stuff, not the $100,000 scanner that tells you what the software already knows. Because we're going to be working on problems that software already can't solve, which means our tools are our knowledge, not our equipment. That's a harder way to work, Priya said. Yes, Mason said, it is. Why would we want that? Mason looked at her. You've been at Hawthorne for 14 months, he said. Before that, you were at a German division that you left after 2 years. Before that, you were an engineering student who, according to your program records that I don't technically have access to, but that Marcus apparently does, he glanced at Marcus, who was standing near the door with the neutral expression of someone who had absolutely looked at Priya's program records and would maintain plausible deniability about this indefinitely. placed in the top 4% of your class in systems diagnostics, and then went to work in a service environment rather than a development environment because you wanted to work on real cars with real problems rather than theoretical ones. Priya was very still. You work harder than this job asks you to, Mason said. All three of you do. That's not comfortable for the people around you because harder than required is disruptive in environments that are calibrated for efficient, and you've all felt that. What I'm offering you is an environment calibrated for the kind of work you're actually doing. That's why you'd want it. Garrett made a sound, not quite a laugh. You looked at all our files. Marcus looked at your files, Mason said. I asked him specific questions and he found specific answers. What questions? I asked who in this organization had solved problems their training didn't prepare them for in the past 18 months. 3 names came up. He paused. You're the 3 names. Dominic was looking at the table. When he looked up, something in his face had shifted. Not the defensive posture he'd walked in with, but something more open and also more wary. The specific expression of someone who had been looked at accurately for the first time in a while and wasn't sure yet if that was safe. What's the actual day-to-day? He said. What are we doing? Cases the service centers can't close, Mason said. Cars that have been through standard diagnostic and either come back wrong or come back clean when the client knows something is still wrong. We look at them without the software leading us. We ask what the car is actually telling us. We're wrong sometimes. We document why we were wrong. We learn from it, and we try again. He looked at all 3 of them. And while we're doing that, you're learning from me, and I'm probably learning things from you, and that's the structure. You said probably, Priya said. I said probably because I don't know yet, he said. You might know things I don't. Priya, your platform architecture background is different from mine in ways that might matter for certain problem types. Dominic, the way you describe the fuel injector diagnosis, that's a specific kind of attention that isn't taught, it's developed. Garrett, he looked at Garrett, you caught a software interaction fault that 2 certified technicians missed because you noticed a timing pattern on a display that was technically within tolerance. That's pattern recognition of a level that I take seriously. Garrett looked at him. You're not going to tell me to follow protocol. I'm going to tell you that protocol exists for reasons, Mason said, and that ignoring it has costs, including the cost of making it harder for people to trust your judgment when you're right, which you were. But being right and being right in a way that's sustainable are different things. He paused. I'll teach you the difference if you're willing to learn it. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. That's more honest than I expected. I'm not going to manage you, Mason said. Managing people like you doesn't work. I've seen it tried. The room settled into a different quality of quiet. Not uncomfortable, but weighted, the specific weight of people deciding something real. Vivian watched it and didn't speak. It was Priya who said it first. I'm in. Dominic said, yeah, in the way of someone who had already decided and was just waiting for the question to be properly formed. Garrett looked at his hands, then at Mason. One question, he said. Go ahead. The take-on thing, he said. The reprimand. Does that follow me into this? Mason looked at him steadily. What do you think it should do? Garrett's jaw tightened slightly. I think what I did was right. I think the process I used was wrong. I think those 2 things can both be true. They can, Mason said, and if that's how you think about it, then no. It doesn't follow you. The record is Marcus's problem, not mine. Marcus, from his position near the door, said, noted, in the tone of someone for whom a personnel record was a very small piece of administration. Garrett exhaled. Then I'm in, he said. After the mechanics left, Dominic and Priya together, talking already, the quick technical conversation of 2 people comparing languages and finding they're the same. And Garrett alone, hands in his pockets, with the walk of someone who had been expecting a door to close and was still working out that it hadn't. After all 3 were gone, Vivian and Mason were left in the conference room with the coffee that nobody had finished and the afternoon light coming in at the angle it came at 4 o'clock, long and amber and slightly tired. You'd looked at their files before Friday, she said. I asked Marcus for the supervisor notes on Thursday, he said. I wanted to know what I was walking into, and if they'd been different, If Marcus had pulled different names, then I'd have said I needed more time to find the right people. He said this without apology, just information. The people in the room matter more than the space or the resources or the structure. I've seen well-funded programs fail because they staff to credential. I've seen underfunded operations do remarkable work because they had 3 people with the right kind of mind. She thought about the right kind of mind. What is the right kind? He considered it. The kind that's bothered by incomplete explanations, he said. Most people, when they hit a wall in a diagnostic, clean scan, no fault, no apparent cause, they close the loop in their head. They say, the equipment says it's fine, so it's fine, and the client is wrong, or the client is imagining it, and they move on. He paused. The right kind of mind can't do that. It registers the incomplete explanation as unacceptable. It keeps returning to it. That's not a skill you can teach. It's a cognitive habit. You can develop it once it's there, but you can't install it from scratch. Did Lily interrupt your thinking about that when you were getting her ready for school this morning? The question came out slightly differently than she'd intended it. More direct, maybe. Less professional. She saw a flicker of surprise on his face, quickly followed by something that was not annoyance, more like reassessment. She wanted to know what I was going to do today, he said. I told her I was going to a meeting. She asked if the meeting was boring. I told her it was probably going to be interesting. She told me to make sure I drank water. A pause that carried something in it. She's decided I don't drink enough water. She puts a water bottle in my bag every morning. Vivian looked at him. She's 8? 8 and 4 months, he said. She's been tracking the months since she turned 8. I don't know why. She has several projects going simultaneously at any given time that I don't fully understand. What kind of projects? Currently, she's building what she describes as a library, but which is actually a system for organizing her stuffed animals by personality rather than size or species. She has a classification system. She's been working on it for 3 weeks. He paused. She consulted me once about the classification criteria. I offered a suggestion. She considered it for about 10 seconds and then told me politely that I was thinking about it wrong. Vivian found herself smiling. Was she right? Almost certainly, he said. I have a limited understanding of stuffed animal personality as a categorical variable. The smile stayed on her face for a moment after she'd have expected it to leave. She became aware of this and didn't do anything about it. When do you want to start? She said. The space needs the workbench and the temperature management, he said, and the whiteboard. 2 weeks to get that done right? I can do it in 10 days. 2 weeks is fine. Don't rush the workbench. If it's wrong, it'll be wrong every day for however long we're in that space. He paused. I want to be there when they install it. I have specific dimensions. Of course you do, she said, and the way it came out was more relaxed than she usually sounded in professional conversations. And he registered this with a look that was almost amused, but not quite. The look of someone who noticed something and filed it rather than producing it. One more thing, he said. Tell me. The cases we take on, he said. I want final say on what we accept, not what's on a list from the service centers, not what's been prioritized by the client tier system, what we can actually do something about. You said that before. I know, I want it in writing. She looked at him. You want a contract provision. I want clarity, he said. Before we start, not after. It's easier to agree on things before anyone has a stake in the outcome. She thought about this. That cuts both ways, she said. I'd want to know if you're declining a case for a reason I should understand. Then I'd tell you, he said. I said I'd be direct with you. That goes in both directions. She nodded. I'll have the legal team draft the specific language. We'll review it together before anything is signed. Good. He picked up his bag. She walked with him toward the exit. The way she occasionally walked with people at the end of meetings she found more substantive than most, which was not something she did as a rule, and which she noticed herself doing as it was happening. At the door he stopped. I want to ask you something, he said. Go ahead. He looked at her with the directness he'd brought to everything. Why does it matter to you, the structural problem, the diagnostic gap? You could have fixed the Chiron, hired Forsyth's team on retainer, insulated yourself from the gap, and nothing in your organization would change. He paused. You're building something instead. Why? She held his gaze. The honest answer was more complicated than the professional one, and she considered which one to give him and then decided, on the basis of the conversation they'd been having for the past several days, that he'd asked because he wanted the honest one. "I misjudged you," she said, "in the first 30 seconds. You walked into that bay in a worn jacket, and I had already decided what you were. And then you told my best specialist something he didn't know and fixed my car in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee." She paused. "I've been running an organization for 9 years, and I tell myself I see people accurately. I don't always. I saw your jacket, not you. And I'd almost had you walked out." She paused again. "That's a mistake I can make once and survive. I can't make it as a practice." He was quiet for a moment, not uncomfortable quiet. The quiet of someone absorbing something honestly said. "That's a better answer than I expected," he said. "I've been giving you better answers than expected," she said. "Seems to be a pattern." "It is." He pushed the door. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she said. He went out. The door closed with the specific soft click of a well-made door, which was one of the things this building had that she'd never consciously appreciated before. The 2 weeks were not smooth. Construction on the workbench ran into a delay when the custom-cut hardwood came in the wrong dimension and had to be reordered, which pushed the installation schedule by 4 days and produced an exchange between the contractor and Marcus that Marcus described in his summary to Vivian as definitively resolved. The temperature management system required an HVAC subcontractor who wasn't available until the second week, which meant the room sat in finished but not functional state for longer than she'd wanted. And Garrett's formal personnel transfer from Greenwich ran into an HR processing issue that Marcus resolved by making 3 phone calls that he didn't document. Through all of this, Mason came by twice, not for scheduled visits. He came by the way people came to check on something they were invested in, without announcement, in the middle of a morning, staying 40 minutes or an hour, looking at the progress, asking specific questions about the workbench dimensions, standing in the center of the space with his hands in his jacket pockets, and that quality of attention he brought to everything. He and Marcus developed what appeared to be a functional working relationship that was based almost entirely on mutual recognition of competence without any particular warmth, which suited both of them. He brought Lily on one of the visits. It was a Saturday, which Vivian hadn't expected, and she happened to be in the building catching up on the week's deferred correspondence when Marcus told her via text, "Mason's here. Daughter too. They're in the East Bay." She walked over. Lily was standing in the middle of the space, which still smelled of fresh construction and was partially staged but not finished, looking at the ceiling the way children looked at things that were bigger than them. Not awed, exactly, more evaluating. She was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt with a drawing on the front that appeared to be a fox of some kind, and she had her father's dark hair and a directness to her gaze that was immediately, obviously, her father's. "That's a lot of lights," she said, to nobody in particular, as Vivian came in. "It is," Vivian said. Lily looked at her without startle, which suggested Mason had mentioned she might be there, and with the specific unselfconsciousness of children who had been raised in environments that didn't reward performing smallness for adults. "Are you the car lady?" she asked. "Lily," Mason said from across the room, where he was examining the workbench installation without looking up. "What? That's what you said." Vivian looked at him. He was not looking at her. There was something happening on his face that she thought was the managed version of something that would otherwise be visible. "I said she owns a car company," he said. "That's the same thing," Lily said, and then to Vivian, "Do you have a lot of cars?" "A reasonable number," Vivian said. "How many?" "Lily." Mason still wasn't looking up. "I'm just asking." "It's all right," Vivian said. "About 47 locations worth," she said. "Each location has inventory, so quite a few total." Lily absorbed this. "Are any of them purple?" "Probably not." "You should get a purple one," Lily said, with the authority of someone whose opinion on this was final. "Purple is underrepresented in cars." Vivian looked at Mason. He was now looking at her, briefly, with the expression she'd seen a few times now. The real smile. The one that came from somewhere. He looked back at the workbench. "She's right about purple," he said. "Historically underrepresented." I'll look into it, Vivian said, and meant it in the way you meant things that you'd been told with genuine conviction. Lily wandered over to where Mason was standing and inserted herself into the space beside him in the particular way children inserted themselves beside parents they were comfortable with. Not asking for attention, just occupying the same geography, the way two things fit together by long practice. Mason shifted slightly to accommodate her without breaking his examination of the workbench, and she stood with her shoulder against his arm and looked at what he was looking at. "Is it right?" she asked. "It's close," he said. "The height is right. The depth is about a centimeter off what I wanted, but I'm going to work with it." "Can you fix it?" "I can adapt to it." "That's not the same as fixing it." "No," he said, "but sometimes adapting is the better choice." Lily considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom her father's observations were data. Then she looked at Vivian. "He talks like that at home too," she said, "like everything is a lesson." "I don't talk like," Mason started. "You do a little," Lily said without hostility. "Just accurate." "Okay," he said. "Maybe a little." Vivian was quiet, watching the two of them, and felt something she didn't have a clean label for. Not envy exactly, because she didn't want what he had, or not in a way she could identify. More like recognition. The recognition of something that cost something to build and was worth the cost. She'd been building for 9 years. She had 47 locations and $2 billion in revenue and a Bugatti in her private bay that finally ran. She had Marcus and a building full of people who were good at their jobs and a reputation that had survived 10 days of press coverage about a car that wouldn't start. She didn't have whatever it was she was looking at. She decided this was useful information and not something to be sad about, and she filed it the way she filed things that were true, but didn't yet have a place in the structure of her daily decisions. "It's going to be a good space," Mason said. He was looking at the room overall now, the full sweep of it. "Yes," she said. "The mechanics are ready," he said. "Priya's been texting me questions, that's a good sign. Dominic's been in twice on his own time to look at the space. Garrett hasn't come by, but he sent me a 12-paragraph message about a Lamborghini diagnostic case from 3 years ago that he thinks might be relevant to our methodology." "Is it?" "Parts of it," he said. "He's thinking about it the right way. He's just not sure yet how to say what he's thinking, which is a different problem and one I can work with." She nodded. She thought about the four of them: Mason, Dominic, Priya, Garrett, and the space that was almost ready, and the work that was almost beginning, and the fact that none of it had a guaranteed outcome, which was the particular truth about real things that she had to hold on to in order to not manage it to death before it had a chance to breathe. "One more week," she said. "One more week," he agreed. Lily had moved to the whiteboard, which was the one thing fully installed and ready. She picked up a marker that had been left on the tray and looked at the blank white surface with an expression of absolute intent. "Can I?" she asked. Mason looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Lily. "It's your dad's whiteboard," she said. Mason was quiet for a moment. "One thing," he said. "Small." Lily drew a fox in the lower left corner of the whiteboard. It took her about 90 seconds and was considerably better than Vivian expected. Not childish exactly, more like the drawing of someone who had been practicing a specific thing for a long time and had gotten good at it. The fox was sitting, looking to one side, with a quality of alertness that was difficult to articulate but genuinely present. "Done," Lily said, and put the marker back. Mason looked at it for a moment. "That's going to stay there," he said. "I know," Lily said, and it did stay there. Through everything that followed, through all the cases and the long afternoons and the arguments and the breakthroughs and the setbacks, through all of it, in the lower left corner of the whiteboard in the East Bay, there was a small alert fox drawn in blue marker by an 8-year-old girl who had decided the space needed something that wasn't a car. It was the first thing anyone added to the room. It turned out not to be a small thing at all. The division opened on a Tuesday, which was not planned. It was simply the day everything was ready, the workbench sealed and dimensionally acceptable, the temperature management system running correctly, the whiteboard with Lily's fox intact in the lower left corner where it had been for 12 days. Marcus had wanted to do something to mark the occasion. Mason had said he'd rather just start working, and that had been the end of that conversation. The first case came in on Wednesday. It was a Rolls-Royce Ghost, belonging to a client of the Greenwich Center named Theodore Abbots, who was 71 years old, had owned Rolls-Royces for most of his adult life, and whose relationship with Hawthorne's Greenwich location was the kind of long-standing client relationship that service center managers used as examples in training sessions about what loyalty looked like when it was properly cultivated. The Ghost had been through standard diagnostics twice in the preceding 6 weeks. Both times the scan had returned clean. Both times the car had been returned to Abbott's with a clean bill and a detailed summary of the diagnostic results. Both times Abbott's had driven it for 3 days and then called back to say something still felt wrong. The specific complaint was difficult to articulate, which was part of why it had been difficult to diagnose. Abbott's described it as a vibration. Not a vibration you felt exactly, more a vibration you heard, a resonance at a specific speed range, somewhere between 45 and 60 miles per hour, that didn't present on acceleration or deceleration, only at cruise. Not every time. Not on every road surface. Just sometimes, at that speed, in conditions Abbott's couldn't pinpoint. The diagnostic team at Greenwich had driven it twice and felt nothing. The software had found nothing. The service manager had written, in his summary notes, the phrase "within normal operating parameters" 3 times in the same document, which was, Mason pointed out to Priya the morning the case file arrived in the East Bay, the specific phrase people used when they'd stopped looking for the actual answer. Abbott's has been a Hawthorne client for 16 years, Mason said, looking at the file on the workbench. 16 years, multiple cars, multiple service relationships. He's not someone who calls back with phantom complaints. The file says he's been difficult, Priya said. She was reading the summary notes on her tablet, the one she'd brought from home because the division's equipment was not yet fully populated, and she'd gotten tired of waiting. 3 references to him being persistent, with a tone that means annoying. He's persistent because nobody has solved his problem, Mason said. That's not difficult, that's appropriate. Dominic was at the other end of the workbench, working through the Ghost's electrical schematics on a laptop. He'd pulled the factory documentation, the service history, and 3 years of Rolls-Royce technical service bulletins, and had organized them in a way that Mason had looked at for about 45 seconds before saying that the organizational logic was good, and then going back to the case file. For Dominic, who had spent 14 months at Hawthorne, being told his methods were unconventional, in a tone that suggested unconventional was a deficiency, this had registered as significant. Speed-specific resonance with no surface dependency, Dominic said. That's aeroacoustic or drivetrain harmonic, probably not electrical. Tell me about the aeroacoustic option, Mason said. At 45 to 60 cruise, the aerodynamic loading on the body panels changes. If there's a seal, a fit tolerance, a panel gap that's shifted slightly outside spec, maybe from an impact, even a minor one, a parking lot thing the client didn't report, you can get a resonance at specific speeds that isn't present at low speed because the loading isn't there, and isn't present at high speed because the frequency shifts out of the audible harmonic range. And the drivetrain option? Driveshaft harmonic, Garrett said from the corner of the room where he'd been quiet for the past 30 minutes, sitting on a stool with his arms folded in the way he sat when he was thinking rather than avoiding. Specifically, a driveshaft that's been balanced to factory spec but has developed a slight asymmetry. Wear microdamage, something that shifts the balance point without putting it outside tolerance thresholds. At that speed range, the rotational frequency of the driveshaft hits a harmonic that the chassis picks up. It doesn't vibrate. It resonates. You hear it before you feel it. In a Rolls cabin at cruise, with all the acoustic isolation that car has, a vibration you feel would have to be significant, a resonance you hear. That could be almost nothing and still be audible. Mason looked at him. That's specific. I've been thinking about it since this morning, Garrett said. I had a BMW case 2 years ago with a similar symptom profile. Different car, different cause, but the description, you hear it before you feel it, that's driveshaft harmonic. I'd bet on it. Don't bet on it, Mason said. Go find it. Tartone. The Ghost arrived Thursday morning and went up on the lift by 9:15. Mason had all 3 of them underneath it within 20 minutes. Not all doing the same thing, but positioned at different points of the drivetrain with different tasks. The way he'd explained the previous afternoon when they'd mapped out the inspection approach on the whiteboard above Lily's Fox. Garrett was at the drive shaft. Priya was at the rear differential. Dominic was running a systematic panel gap check on the exterior, moving around the car with a feeler gauge and a flashlight in the deliberate way of someone who had been told to look for something specific and was not going to miss it. Mason moved between them. He asked questions rather than directing. Not the questions of someone testing, but the questions of someone thinking alongside. What are you seeing? What would that tell you if it changed? If you're right about that, what would you expect to find at the adjacent component? An hour in, Garrett called from under the rear of the car. "Come look at this," he said. Mason was there in seconds. He got under the lift beside Garrett, who had a light positioned at a specific angle on the rear driveshaft coupling. "Right there," Garrett said. "The coupling flange. See the wear pattern?" Mason looked. The wear pattern was subtle, the kind of thing you could look at for 3 seconds and decide was within tolerance, because it technically was within tolerance, if tolerance was the thing you were measuring. The coupling flange showed a slightly uneven contact pattern on one side, consistent with a very small angular misalignment that had been present long enough to produce differential wear between the two contact faces. "That's not dramatic," Mason said. "No," Garrett said, "but watch what it does to the shaft balance at rotation." He pointed to a specific section of the shaft. The coupling misalignment shifts the shaft's effective balance point, not by much, not enough to throw a fault, but at the right rotational speed. "It hits the resonant frequency of the chassis mounting," Mason said. "Between 45 and 60, Garrett said. "Above 60, the frequency shifts. Below 45, you're not generating enough rotation speed." Mason was quiet for a moment, lying on the creeper under the car, looking at the coupling flange and Garrett's light. "How long has the misalignment been there?" "The wear pattern suggests months, maybe longer. Not from an impact. From a previous service that seated the coupling slightly off, probably imperceptible at the time, producing differential wear over miles that slowly shifted the balance." "So it was introduced during service?" "Almost certainly." The words landed with the weight that both of them felt. A misalignment introduced during service at Hawthorne that had produced a problem the service center then twice failed to identify. This was not a comfortable finding. This was the kind of finding that, in most organizations, created pressure to be described differently, to be softened, contextualized, phrased in a way that distributed the weight of it across enough technical qualifications that its central meaning became hard to extract. Mason got out from under the car. He stood and looked at it on the lift for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. "The ghost problem is a coupling flange misalignment, probably introduced in a previous service at the Greenwich Center," he said. "I need a meeting with Vivian this afternoon." There was a short pause on Marcus's end. "I'll arrange it," Marcus said. "Tell her it's not bad news," Mason said. "It's just actual news." That she was in her office when he came in at 2:15, which was early enough that he'd have time to get back to the bay before 3. He came in with the canvas bag, which he always carried, and sat in the chair across from her desk in the way he always sat, straight, without the forward lean of someone performing engagement. She'd been briefed by Marcus in the 30 minutes before Mason arrived. She'd read the summary. She'd had 30 minutes to process it, which was not a lot of time, but enough to know where she stood. "Before you say anything," she said, "I want you to know I'm not going to ask you to soften the client communication." He looked at her. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you told me in that first meeting that you could work with True," he said. "And because if I'd had any reason to think otherwise, I wouldn't have called Marcus." She absorbed this. "You would have walked." I would have walked," he said, without drama. "Just fact." She nodded. She looked at the summary on her desk. "Abbott's has been a client for 16 years, she said. "He's going to be angry." "He has a reason to be angry," Mason said. "His car was serviced here and the service introduced a problem, and then the diagnostic team missed the problem twice. That's a legitimate reason for anger." "Yes," she said. "I know." She paused. "I want to be the one who calls him, not the service manager, not a client relations person, me." Mason looked at her. "That's the right call. Tell me exactly what to say technically, not a script, the accurate version." He walked her through it. The coupling flange, the misalignment, the service origin, the resonance mechanism. He was precise without being clinical, which was a specific skill. The skill of someone who had translated technical information to non-technical people enough times to know where the loss of meaning happened. She listened without interrupting, the way she listened when the information mattered, which was different from the way she listened in most meetings. When he was done, she said, "Can it be fixed here?" By Garrett, yes. He knows exactly what he's looking for now, and the correction is a proper reseating of the coupling with the correct alignment jig. Half a day's work. Good. She paused. I want to offer Abbott's the repair at no charge and a full refund of his last 2 diagnostic visits. And I want to have a conversation with the Greenwich service manager about the original service that introduced the misalignment. The conversation is going to be uncomfortable, Mason said. Most useful conversations are, she said. That's not a reason not to have it. He nodded. He was looking at her with something she'd come to recognize over the past weeks. A quality of attention that was not evaluative in the way of someone deciding whether to trust her, but more like the attention of someone who had already decided and was simply watching the decision bear out. There's something else, he said. Tell me. This kind of fault, coupling misalignment from a service procedure, it's not unique to this car or this case, he said. It's a category of error that's common in high-end service environments where the technicians are trained on diagnostics but not on the specific torque and alignment tolerances of the platforms they're servicing. The training assumes the software will catch deviations. The software doesn't always catch deviations, which means there may be other cars that have been through the Greenwich and Stamford centers with similar introduced faults that haven't presented yet, or have presented in ways the client can't articulate clearly enough to generate a diagnostic follow-up. She looked at him. You're telling me this might be systemic. I'm telling you it might be worth looking at, he said. I'm not telling you it's a crisis, but if it's a pattern, you'd rather know now. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of someone doing the calculation she needed to do, not the financial calculation, though that was real, but the more fundamental one about what kind of organization she was running and what kind of organization she wanted to be running. How would you look at it? She said. Priya and Dominic, he said, give them access to the service records from both centers for the past 18 months, specifically the records where a car came back for a repeat visit within 60 days of service. That's the flag pattern. A car that was serviced, went out, and came back. Not because the original problem wasn't solved, but because the service introduced something. He paused. It'll take time. A few weeks, probably. We'd be doing it alongside the casework. Do it, she said. He looked at her steadily. If we find something, I'm going to tell you what we find. Unmodified. I know, she said. And then you decide what to do with it. Not me. I'll have an opinion and I'll share it, but the organizational response is yours. Also correct, she said. He stood, picked up the canvas bag, and then stopped at the door the way he sometimes stopped, with something additional to say that he'd been holding until the main conversation was done. The mechanics, he said. Garrett, especially. I want you to know. The reprimand on his record. The Taycan thing. He was right. Not just about the car. About the principle. The process he violated existed for reasons, and some of those reasons were good, but the process also assumed that being within diagnostic tolerance meant being safe, and it doesn't. Not always. He paused. If you're having the conversation with the Greenwich service manager about introduced faults, I'd like that reprimand addressed at the same time. Not erased. Addressed, with a note in the record that the underlying judgment was sound even when the procedure wasn't. She looked at him. That's a personnel request. Yes. You care about that. He walked away from a job that didn't value what he could see, Mason said. Twice, from different places, for the same reason. If we're building something that values it, I want the record to reflect that. She held his gaze. I'll talk to HR this afternoon. He nodded once. He went out. The Abbott's call lasted 42 minutes, which was longer than Vivian had expected and shorter than she'd feared. Abbott's was, as she'd anticipated, angry. A specific, contained anger of a man who had been right about something for 6 weeks and been told implicitly that he was wrong by people who had clean diagnostic reports to point to. She let him be angry. She didn't manage it or redirect it or deploy any of the client-handling language she could have deployed. She let him say what he needed to say, and then she told him what they'd found, specifically in plain language that Mason had given her, and she told him how it had happened and what she was going to do about it. There was a silence on the line after she finished. "Nobody's ever told me the honest version of something like this before," Abbott said. His voice had changed, not soft. He wasn't the softening type, she could tell, but different, like a pressure had gone out of it. "I've been a customer of this company for 16 years, 3 different service managers, 4 different locations. And when something went wrong, the conversation was always," he paused, "managed. You know what I mean." "I know what you mean," she said. This is different." "I'm trying to make it different," she said. "I won't tell you I'm certain I'll always get it right. But I'm trying." Another pause. "The man who found it," Abbott said. "Who was that?" She thought about how to answer this. "Someone I should have listened to sooner," she said. The systemic review took 3 weeks, not 2. Priya drove it, with Dominic running parallel analysis on the electrical side cases, and what they found was neither catastrophic nor trivial. Across both service centers, in the 18-month window, there were 11 vehicles with the flag pattern, returned within 60 days of a service procedure, with a complaint that didn't map cleanly to the original service issue. Of the 11, 4 had complaints that, on re-examination, were consistent with introduced faults similar in category to the ghosts. The other 7 were either genuinely unrelated or insufficient in data to determine. 4 cars out of the center's full service volume for 18 months was a small number in percentage terms. It was not a small number in terms of what it meant about the training gap Mason had identified, the gap between diagnostic competence and procedural precision on high-tolerance platforms. Priya wrote the summary in the precise, dry language of someone who had learned to let findings speak without editorializing, which was a quality Mason had been specific about when she'd shown him the draft. "Don't soften it and don't dramatize it," he'd said. "Just say what it is." She'd taken out 3 sentences that she recognized on rereading as cushioning and replaced them with nothing, which was the right call. Mason walked the summary into Vivian's office on a Thursday morning, set it on her desk, and stood across from her while she read it. He didn't sit. He read people while they read things, which was a habit from development work. You learn things from how someone received difficult information that you didn't learn from what they said about it afterward. She read it straight through, no reactions on her face, not suppressed reactions, just the absence of them, the specific focus of someone reading for content rather than impression. When she finished, she set it down and looked at him. 4 vehicles, she said. 4 that we can demonstrate, he said. Possibly 5. The 5th is ambiguous. What do you recommend? Proactive outreach to all 4 clients, he said. Same approach as Abbott's. Honest, direct. Here's what happened. Here's what we're going to do. Not, we've identified a potential concern. Not, we want to follow up as part of a quality review. The actual thing. The legal exposure on proactive disclosure is probably lower than the exposure on the alternative, he said. You can have your legal team tell you that, but the practical answer is that if one of those 4 cars produces a more serious fault before the clients come back in, you're in a significantly worse position than if you've already had the honest conversation. She looked at him. You've thought about the legal framing? I've thought about every part of it, he said. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. But the legal framing isn't why I'm recommending this. He paused. I'm recommending this because it's right. The legal framing is why it's also strategically sound. Those are different arguments, and I want you to know which one I'm actually making. She looked at him for a moment, then at the summary, then at him again. I'll call legal this afternoon, she said, and I want to start the client conversations next week. Good, he said. Mason. She said it in the way she said his name when she was moving towards something that wasn't strictly professional. The qualities she'd developed in these conversations of occasionally crossing the line between the role and the person. This is going to create discomfort internally. The service managers are going to feel exposed. Some of them are going to push back. They're going to want to know why the diagnostics division is reviewing their records. Because the diagnostics division exists to find what standard process misses, he said, which sometimes means looking at how standard process produced a problem. That's not punitive, that's the job. I know that, you know that. Convincing the service managers is your job, he said. Not mine. I find the problem. You handle what happens next in the organization. He paused. You told me in the first meeting that you could work with True. This is what True looks like when it's not convenient. She held his gaze. I know what it looks like, she said. I didn't say it would be easy. I said I could work with it. He nodded. He picked up the canvas bag. I have to be at the bay by noon, he said. There's a Ferrari case Dominic has been working that I want to look at before he closes it. Go, she said. He was at the door when she said his name again. He turned. The division's been running for 6 weeks, she said. How's it going? Honestly, not the summary version. He was quiet for a moment. Honestly, he said. It's hard. The work is harder than I expected, and I expected it to be hard. Garrett and Priya and Dominic are good, but they're still learning how to trust their own judgment when the equipment disagrees with them. And that's a slow process that I can't accelerate just by telling them to. You have to be wrong and be wrong in a way that teaches you something, and that takes time. He paused. But last week, Dominic caught a brake bias fault on a Bentley that would have gone back to the client clean. He caught it in the way I'd want him to catch it, not with the equipment, with his understanding of how the system behaves under load. That's 3 months ahead of where I thought he'd be. And the other two? Priya is the one who's going to be remarkable, he said. She already is, in some ways. She just doesn't know it yet, which is a version of the same problem she's had everywhere she's worked. She's been around people who weren't good enough to recognize what she was doing. It'll take a while for her to trust that this environment is different. He paused. Garrett is doing something I didn't expect. He's become the one who holds the others to the standard. Not formally. Just when one of them wants to close something prematurely, Garrett is the one who says not yet. He hated that quality in himself at Greenwich because it made him difficult. Here it's useful. She looked at him. And you? She said. How is it for you? He was quiet, not avoidant, just finding the right honest shape of the answer. It's the most useful I've felt in 4 years, he said. That's not comfortable to admit, because the 4 years weren't nothing. I was where I needed to be. But this is, he stopped. This is what I was built to do. I'd forgotten that. You can forget it, it turns out. She held that for a moment. I'm glad you didn't let security walk you out, she said. Something crossed his face, the real smile, quick and genuine. I'm glad you called me back, he said. He went out. The internal discomfort Vivian had predicted arrived, as predicted, the following week. The Greenwich service manager, a capable, experienced man named Howard Delisle, who had run that center for 7 years and whose numbers were consistently good, came into her office on a Monday afternoon with the controlled affect of someone who had been composing his reaction for several days. I want to understand the scope of the diagnostics division's mandate, he said, which was the professional way of saying, I want to know if these people are going to be looking at my operation. The scope is finding problems standard diagnostic can't close, she said, which sometimes means looking at how problems were introduced. The ghost case, he said, among others. He looked at her steadily. He was not a man who performed emotions easily, which she'd always respected about him. The technician who handled that service is one of my best, he said. 12 years of experience, consistent record, no prior incidents. I know, she said. This isn't about assigning blame to a technician. It's about identifying a training gap in how we're handling high-tolerance alignment procedures on certain platforms. That's a structural issue, not a personnel issue. The difference matters in how it's handled. Yes, she said. That's why I'm making the distinction. He was quiet for a moment. And the review of our service records has produced findings that we're acting on proactively, she said, before those findings became problems we were reacting to. She looked at him. Howard, I know this feels like scrutiny. It is scrutiny. The division exists to find what we're missing, and some of what we're missing is going to be uncomfortable to find. That's the point. If it only found comfortable things, it wouldn't be worth having. He looked at her. Will this continue? The records review? The records review for the 18-month window is complete, she said. Going forward, cases that come to the division will be flagged if they suggest an introduced fault. At that point, yes, we'd look at the relevant service record, not as an audit, as part of solving the problem. I want my service managers in the loop when that happens. Reasonable, she said. I'll have Marcus establish the communication protocol. He nodded, the nod of a man who was not satisfied but recognized this was as far as satisfaction was available to him today. The mechanics you pulled from my center, he said. Priya Anand. What about her? She's talented, he said. I knew she was talented. I wasn't able to. The structure of the center doesn't. He stopped. Is she coming back at some point? Vivian looked at him. She's where she needs to be right now, she said. What happens after that depends on what she wants. He nodded again. He stood. At the door he paused in the way people paused when they had something remaining that they hadn't yet committed to saying. The man running the division, he said. Ryder. What about him? I heard what happened with the Chiron, he said. Not the press version, the actual version. From Carl, one of my junior techs who was in the Bay. He paused. I've been in automotive service for 23 years. I've worked with Forsyth. He's good at what he does. He paused again. What Ryder did in that Bay, I don't have a category for that. That's not a skill you can train. No, she said. It's not. He left without saying anything else, which was its own kind of statement, the acknowledgement that some things didn't need to be elaborated on, just recognized. She sat at her desk after he'd gone and thought about categories, about the ones that existed and the ones that didn't yet, and the things that fell into the gap between them, which was where most of the things that actually mattered seemed to live. She thought about a worn jacket and a canvas bag and a $30 multimeter and a piece of wire, and the 16 specialists with their rolling cases full of equipment who'd spent 10 days looking at documentation instead of looking at the car. She thought about Garrett saying not yet when someone wanted to close a case too soon. She thought about Priya's 12-paragraph summary that said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing that it didn't. She thought about Dominic, 3 months ahead of where Mason had expected him to be, catching a brake bias fault with his understanding rather than his equipment. She thought about the fox in the lower left corner of the whiteboard, which she'd seen again this morning when she'd stopped by the bay, still there exactly as Lily had drawn it, slightly faded now from the whiteboard cleaner that Dominic had used last week on the upper two-thirds of the board without quite reaching the corner. An accidental preservation, or a deliberate one, she wasn't sure. She thought about this fact that she was thinking about all of these things in the middle of an afternoon that should have been consumed by the Q3 review and the acquisition conversation she'd been deferring for 2 weeks, and the 7 other things on her desk that each had a legitimate claim on her attention. She thought about what Mason had said. This is what I was built to do. I'd forgotten that. She sat with that for a while. She let it mean what it meant without trying to put it somewhere useful. Then she picked up her phone and called legal because the proactive client conversations needed a framework, and the framework needed to be right, and there were things that required your attention even when your attention was somewhere else entirely. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was the kind of detail you didn't notice until afterward, when you were reconstructing the sequence of how things changed. Not an email, an actual letter on heavy cream paper with the letterhead of Veritas Automotive Group, which was the 3rd largest luxury automotive retailer in North America and had been, for most of the past 6 years, Hawthorne's most direct and most aggressive competitor. Marcus brought it in at 9 in the morning with the expression he wore when something required her attention before anything else did. She read it standing at her desk, which was how she read things she wasn't sure about. Standing gave her the option to move, to pace, to let her body process what her mind was working on. The letter was from a man named Conrad Ellery, who was Veritas's CEO and who she had met 4 times at industry events over the years, each time briefly and in the specific way you met direct competitors at industry events, with complete cordiality and 0 useful information exchanged. It was 2 paragraphs written in the direct style of someone who had decided to say the thing rather than approach it. The first paragraph acknowledged what Hawthorne's diagnostics division had been doing for the past 7 months. The second paragraph said that Veritas had a recurring technical problem across 3 of its flagship centers that its own diagnostic teams had been unable to resolve, and that Conrad Ellery would like to send a team of his senior mechanics to spend 2 weeks in the East Bay at Hawthorne's facility, learning from Mason Ryder if Ms. Hawthorne was open to the conversation. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the window. Her first instinct was no. Not because the request wasn't reasonable, it was, in a specific sense, but because the instinct of 9 years building a competitive organization was to treat advantage as something you protected rather than shared. The diagnostics division was, at this point, unambiguously an advantage. 7 months in, it had closed 18 cases that Standard Diagnostic couldn't resolve, identified and corrected the 4 introduced fault vehicles, and produced a training intervention for alignment procedure protocol that had been implemented across all 47 Hawthorne locations. 3 clients who had been considering moving their service relationships to competitors had instead renewed. Howard Delisle, who had arrived in her office 4 months ago with the controlled affect of a man composing his defensiveness, had told Marcus last month that the ghost case had been the best thing to happen to his center's service culture in 3 years, which Marcus had passed along with the mild satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been validated. Sharing any of that with Veritas was, on the surface, a strange thing to do. She thought about it for 20 minutes, which was longer than she usually spent on first instincts. Then she called Mason. He was in the bay when she called. She could hear the specific acoustic of the space in the background, the particular resonance of a high-ceiling service environment that was active without being loud. "Did Marcus send you the letter?" she said. "He forwarded it an hour ago," Mason said. "And?" A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding, but someone choosing how to say what they'd already decided. "I think you should say yes," he said. She'd expected this and also hadn't expected it. "Tell me why." "Because what we're doing here isn't proprietary," he said. "The methodology isn't a trade secret. It's a way of paying attention. You can't patent paying attention. If Veritas sends their mechanics here and we teach them how to look at a car the way we look at a car, all that happens is there are more people in this industry who can solve problems that equipment alone can't solve, which is better for the industry and better for the clients. It's not worse for Hawthorne. It might reduce our competitive advantage in this specific area." "Maybe," he said, "or it might do something else." "What else?" "It might make us the place that taught the industry how to do this," he said, "which is a different kind of advantage, and a longer one." She stood at her window with the phone and thought about that. Outside, the service complex was visible in the distance, the East Bay identifiable by the skylight configuration that Marcus had cleaned on the day he decided the clearing needed to happen. She thought about 7 months of work, about 18 closed cases, and 4 corrected vehicles, and a whiteboard with a fox in the corner, and 3 mechanics who were doing things their prior environments hadn't given them room to do. She thought about what Mason had said in a different conversation. "You stop trying to hear what you expect to hear." "I'll call Ellery," she said. "Good," Mason said, and then, before she could say anything else, "I need you to come to the bay this afternoon. There's something I want you to see." "When?" 2 o'clock, before I leave for pickup." She came at 2, and the something Mason wanted her to see was not a car. It was Dominic. He was working a case that had come in the previous day. A Maserati Quattroporte with an intermittent engine hesitation that the client had described as the car forgetting what it was doing at highway speed. A description that had appeared in the intake notes with a small editorial note from the service coordinator that said "client's words" in parentheses, which Mason had crossed out with a marker and written next to it. Accurate description, keep it. Dominic was at the workbench with the Maserati's ECU data on a laptop, but he wasn't looking at the laptop. He was looking at a printed timeline he'd constructed by hand, a physical paper timeline of the car's operational data over the past 60 days, laid out in a sequence that tracked engine temperature, fuel delivery timing, and throttle response at 10-minute intervals across multiple drive cycles. He'd done this by pulling the raw data logs and rendering them in a format the diagnostic software didn't produce because the diagnostic software wasn't built to show correlations across time in this specific way. He'd built the format himself, on paper, with a ruler and a pencil, over what Mason later told Vivian had been approximately 5 hours of work the previous evening. He was tracing something with his finger, slowly, across the timeline. He didn't notice Vivian had come in, Or if he did, he didn't register it as requiring his attention, which was its own kind of signal. Mason was standing a few feet away watching him. He glanced at Vivian when she came in, then back at Dominic. "He found it 20 minutes ago," Mason said, quietly enough that Dominic didn't hear. "He's just checking his own work. What did he find?" "Fuel delivery timing degradation that only appears when 3 specific conditions are present simultaneously. Engine heat soaked, highway cruise speed, and a specific ambient temperature range. Below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, the condition doesn't present. Above 75, it resolves on its own within 2 minutes. Between 60 and 75, it produces the hesitation the client described." He paused. "It's a fuel injector pre-charge calibration drift. Very slight, well within the tolerance the diagnostic software checks. But the drift accumulates over time, and in the specific temperature window, it's just enough to cause a timing gap in the delivery sequence." He paused again. "It took Priya and me 2 weeks to develop the methodology for this kind of correlation analysis. I showed it to Dominic once. He built his own version of it, independently, adapted it to this specific case, and found a fault that the software had been missing for 60 days. Vivian looked at Dominic. He was still tracing the timeline, his finger moving back and forth across a specific section, his face carrying the expression she'd learned to recognize in the East Bay, the expression of someone whose understanding and their evidence were finishing the process of becoming the same thing. "He's 22, she said. "He was 22 7 months ago, too," Mason said. "He's the same person. He just hasn't been somewhere that showed him what he could do with what he already had." She stood with that. Dominic looked up. He saw Vivian, and in the specific way that had become characteristic of him over 7 months, not the defensive posture he'd walked in with, but a different kind of self-possession, the kind that comes from being right enough times to trust your own judgment. He said, "Fuel injector pre-charge calibration drift. Temperature-dependent presentation, 60 to 75 degree ambient window. I can have a corrected calibration map by end of day." "Good," Mason said. Dominic looked at Vivian. "Did you come to see something specific?" "I came to see this," she said. He looked at the timeline, then at her. "It's not that complicated," he said. "Once you know what to look for." "That's true of most things that matter," she said. He nodded, accepting this as information, and went back to his timeline. The Veritas mechanics arrived 6 weeks later, 4 of them, on a Monday morning. They were experienced, all in their 30s, all with strong credentials from strong institutions, and they arrived with the specific posture of people who were good at what they did and were not entirely sure what they were doing here, in someone else's facility, ostensibly to learn from a methodology that none of them had heard of 8 months ago. Mason handled the first morning simply. He didn't give them an orientation or philosophy lecture or an explanation of the East Bay's approach. He put a car in front of them, a Bentley Continental that was a live case, an intermittent oil pressure variance that the Hawthorne Service Center hadn't been able to close. And he said, "Tell me what's wrong with it." The Veritas mechanics looked at each other. The one who appeared to be the senior member, a woman named Catherine Ross, who had the focused competence of someone for whom automotive diagnostics was not a job but a specific form of expertise, said, "Can we run the diagnostic software?" "You can," Mason said, "but I want to know what you think first." "About a car we haven't examined?" "About what you can observe without touching it," he said. There was a pause. Then Catherine Ross walked to the Bentley and stood looking at it, and Vivian, who had come to the Bay that morning specifically to watch this, because she understood that what happened in the next few minutes would tell her something significant about how the next 2 weeks would go, watched Catherine's face and saw the moment something shifted in it. The shift from "this is an unusual request" to "all right, let me actually look." What happened over the next 2 weeks was not smooth. It was difficult in the specific way that real learning was difficult, full of the friction of having to set down what you already knew in order to pick up something different, of the discomfort of being in an environment where your credentials didn't carry the weight they usually carried, and what you could actually see and understand was the thing being measured. There were arguments. Catherine Ross argued with Mason on the 3rd day about methodology, about whether the timeline correlation analysis that Dominic had shown them was a genuinely transferable technique or a one-off solution to a specific class of problem that wouldn't generalize. It was a good argument, the kind with real technical substance on both sides. And it went on for 45 minutes in the East Bay, while Priya stood at the workbench and Garrett leaned against the wall and watched it with the expression of someone watching a match between two people they had opinions about. Mason didn't win the argument, which was to say, he didn't convince Catherine entirely, and she didn't convince him entirely, and what they arrived at after 45 minutes was a more precise version of the original question. Not is the technique generalizable, but under what specific conditions does it generalize and under what conditions does it need to be modified? Which was, as Priya pointed out quietly to Dominic afterward, actually a better question than either of them had started with. That's what happens when two people who know what they're talking about actually disagree, Dominic said. Yes, Priya said, it's useful to watch. On the second Friday, Catherine Ross found a fault in a Ferrari that had been in the bay for 4 days. She found it using the timeline correlation method she'd argued against, modified in the specific way she'd proposed during the argument, and the modification was better than the original version in one specific dimension that Mason acknowledged directly and completely, without the hedging that people usually employed when someone else's version of their idea improved on it. Your modification handles the temperature variable more elegantly, he said, looking at what she'd produced. I want to add this to the methodology documentation. Catherine looked at him. You're going to use it. We're going to use it, he said, if that's all right with you. She looked at him for a moment. Conrad told me you were different, she said. I wasn't sure what he meant. What do you think he meant? I think he meant you don't protect the idea, she said. Most people protect the idea. Even when they say they want feedback, they protect it. The idea isn't mine to protect, he said. It's just the best current version of a question we're all asking. She looked at him. Where did you come from? She said. It wasn't a professional question. It was more fundamental than that. Delivery truck, he said, and the thing on his face was the real smile, the one that came from somewhere. Parts delivery, old pickup. She shook her head slightly, not in disbelief but in something more like recognition. The recognition of someone who had spent 20 minutes once standing in front of a car she hadn't touched and had found more than she expected. All right, she said. All right, he said. The day the Veritas mechanics left, Mason drove the Chiron. This was not planned. It happened the way unplanned things happened, as a consequence of a sequence of small decisions that individually seemed unrelated. He'd arrived that morning earlier than usual because Lily had a school project due and had woken herself up at 5:30 to finish it, which meant the house was active before 6, and once he was up, there was no particular reason to wait. He'd come through the main service bay on his way to the East Bay and found the Chiron staged near the exit because Marcus had scheduled it for a full operational check that day, the first time it had been taken out on road since the repair, which was overdue in the way that low-priority things that weren't urgent became overdue without anyone quite deciding to let them. He'd stood looking at it for a moment. Marcus had found him there at 6:45 and had said, without preamble, "You could take it out." Mason had looked at him. "That's not my car." "She hasn't driven it since you fixed it," Marcus said. "It should be driven. You said so yourself." "I said she should have someone cycle it." "Yes," Marcus said, "and I'm suggesting you." He'd looked at the Chiron for another moment. Then he'd gone inside and called Vivian. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake for a while. "Marcus texted me," she said. "Take it." "It's your car," he said. "It's a car that needs to be driven," she said. "You told me that 4 months ago. Take it out for an hour and make sure everything is running correctly. That's a legitimate operational reason." "Vivian Mason," she said, and the way she said his name had the quality it had developed over 7 months of conversations. Direct but not hard, the quality of someone who had learned to mean what they said and expected the same. "Take the car. I'll meet you when you get back." He took the car. What it felt like to drive a Bugatti Chiron was not something that translated into language with any precision. The engineering of it was real in a way that most engineered things weren't. Real in the sense of being exactly what it claimed to be. Nothing performed, nothing compensating for something else. He'd driven cars at this level before, in another life, in the development work, and the feeling was less one of speed than of accuracy. The car did precisely what he asked it to do, with the precision of something built to that single purpose by people who had thought about nothing else for a very long time. He took it on the private loop road that Hawthorne used for operational checks, 2.5 miles of tarmac that curved through the property in a way that provided enough speed range to test a car's systems properly. He took it through the range twice, and on the second pass, when he let it reach the speed band that mattered, 60, 70, the range where the ghost had resonated, the range where problems lived, it ran clean. No resonance, no hesitation, no anomaly of any kind, just the clean, absolute functioning of something that had been correctly repaired. He sat in the car for a moment after he brought it back and turned the engine off. The silence after a Chiron engine stopped had a specific quality. Not emptiness, but absence. The way a room felt after a large sound had left it. He thought about the grounding bridge, the factory defect that only appeared in cold weather, the component that wasn't in the service documentation because the people who built the car had added it after the documentation was written to solve a problem the documentation hadn't anticipated. The thing that 16 specialists had spent 10 days and $700,000 not finding. He thought about what it meant that he'd found it. Not because he was exceptional, he'd never thought of himself that way, and the past 7 months had reinforced his belief that the thing he had wasn't exceptional, it was just particular. A specific kind of attention, a specific habit of mind that refused incomplete explanations. He'd developed it over years of work in a specific environment, and he'd nearly let it atrophy in a parts delivery truck, and he hadn't only because a car had been sitting silent in a bay in a way that he couldn't walk away from, and a woman had called him back when he'd already started to leave. He thought about that. The specific mechanics of how things happened, the small pivots that sent life in one direction rather than another. He didn't believe in fate. He'd thought too concretely about the physical world for too long to be comfortable with fate. But he believed in contingency, in the genuine randomness of which particular morning you made, which particular delivery, which bay you happened to pass, which car happened to be sitting in it. He thought about Claire. He thought about her the way he thought about her most days now, not with the specific searing quality of the first 2 years, but with something softer and more permanent, the way you thought about something that had become part of the architecture of how you saw everything. She would have had opinions about all of this. She'd had opinions about everything, rapid, specific, often right. She would have had a lot to say about Vivian Hawthorne, he thought. He wasn't sure what. He thought she would have recognized something. He got out of the car. But Vivian was at the service bay entrance when he pulled in, which meant she'd arrived in the last few minutes because she hadn't been there when he left. She was in the coat she wore on cool mornings, charcoal wool, no nonsense, and she had a coffee in each hand, which she'd apparently decided was the right thing to bring without being asked, which was the kind of thing she did and then didn't remark on. She handed him one when he got out of the car. "How did it run?" she said. "Perfectly," he said. "Good." He drank the coffee. It was the right temperature. She'd gotten the timing right, which was not a small thing. They stood looking at the Chiron for a moment. The nocturne blue in the morning light, the way it caught things and held them, the way it looked like it had just arrived from somewhere fast. "Conrad Ellery called me yesterday," she said, "to say that Catherine Ross and her team were coming back." He looked at her. "When?" 2 months. He wants a full 4-week engagement this time. He also... She paused, in the way she paused when something had landed differently than she'd expected it to. He also asked if he could send the request to other Veritas Center's senior mechanics, if we were open to making this a recurring program. He was quiet for a moment. "He's going to tell other people," she said, "other organizations. Ellery is well connected and he's not discreet when something works. This is going to become something larger than what we built." "Is that a problem?" he said. "I'm asking you," she said, "because you built it. It's yours in the way that things you build are yours." He looked at the Chiron, then at her. "It was never mine," he said. "I told you that at the beginning. I told you I couldn't protect the idea. The idea is just the best current version of a question." He paused. "If other organizations send their mechanics here, and we teach them something that improves how this industry treats the people who trust it with their cars, that's the point. That's what the thing is for." She looked at him steadily. "You know what will happen. Other divisions will form, in other organizations doing versions of what we're doing. Some of them will do it well. Some of them will do it badly and call it the same thing. People will write articles about the methodology. Someone will put it in a book and claim they invented it." "Probably," he said, and you're all right with that. The work will still be here, he said, the real version. The people who actually know what they're doing will be able to tell the difference between that and the version that got put in a book. He paused. I spent 4 years delivering parts and the work was still in me. It doesn't go away. You can't franchise it out of existence. She was quiet. Then she said, there's something I've been thinking about saying for a while. He looked at her. Say it. She held her coffee in both hands and looked at the car, then at him, with the directness that had been consistent in her from the first morning, the quality he'd decided he trusted before he'd trusted much else about the situation. When you walked into my service bay that morning, I had already made a decision about you, she said. Not a conscious one, the kind you make in the first few seconds, without knowing you're making it. You were a delivery driver in a worn jacket, and I had a room full of specialists, and I processed you accordingly. She paused. I've thought about that more than I expected to, because I run an organization that talks a great deal about seeing people accurately, about not letting the surface determine the assessment, and I didn't do that. I did the opposite, and then I almost made it worse by having you walked out. You called me back, he said. Because I had nothing left to lose, she said, not because I saw clearly. I saw clearly after you'd already shown me something I couldn't argue with. She paused. I want to be honest about the sequence, because the lesson isn't that I eventually did the right thing. The lesson is that I almost didn't for reasons that had nothing to do with your ability and everything to do with what your jacket looked like. He looked at her for a long moment. Why are you telling me this now? Because the Veritas thing is going to grow into something, she said. And when it does, there will be a version of the story that makes it all sound inevitable, that I recognized what you were and built accordingly, and I didn't want that version to be the one that stayed. She paused. You deserve the accurate version. He was quiet. He looked at the car, then at the sky over the service complex, which was the particular shade of late morning blue that didn't last long before it deepened. Most people don't admit that, he said. Most people aren't trying to build what we're building, she said. And you can't build something real on an inaccurate version of how it started. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, she said. They stood in the quiet for a moment. Lily's school thing, he said. The project she was finishing this morning. What was it? She had to do a presentation about someone she thought was good at their job, he said. And why? Vivian looked at him. Who did she choose? Marcus, he said. She stared at him. She met him 3 times, he said. Once when she was in the break room with the juice box, once on the Saturday when she came to look at the space, once when she left the fox on the whiteboard. Apparently that was enough. He paused, and the real smile was there, the one that arrived rather than being produced. She said, and I'm quoting directly, that he was good at his job because he always knew what needed to happen before anyone told him, and he didn't make a big deal about it. Vivian felt something open in her chest that was not sadness and not joy, but a specific compound of both. The feeling of something that was true being said with perfect accuracy by someone who had no idea how precisely true it was. That's the most accurate description of Marcus I've ever heard, she said. She's 8, he said. She sees things. She does, Vivian said. She gets that from somewhere. He looked at her. He didn't say anything, which was its own answer. 3 months after the Veritas mechanic's first visit, a piece ran in a prominent automotive industry journal. Not the trade press, not the YouTube coverage, but a serious long-form piece that had been researched for 6 weeks and interviewed 14 people, including Howard Delisle and Theodore Abbots and Catherine Ross and Conrad Ellery, and 3 of the young mechanics from the Stanford and Greenwich Centers who'd been through what was now being called, in the industry, simply the East Bay program. The journalist had asked to interview Mason, and Mason had declined, which the journalist had included in the piece in a way that managed to say more about him than an interview would have. The piece was titled simply The Quiet Division, and its central argument was that Hawthorne Automotive Group had, accidentally or deliberately, created something that the luxury automotive service industry had needed and hadn't known how to ask for. A model for transmitting the kind of knowledge that couldn't be documented, the pattern recognition and attention and tolerance for incomplete explanations that separated the mechanics who solved problems from the mechanics who managed them. Vivienne read it on a Saturday morning. She read it twice, carefully, the way she read things that mattered. Then she forwarded it to Mason with a one-line message. "This is the accurate version." He replied 40 minutes later, which meant he'd read it while doing something else. Probably in the shop, probably with Lily nearby handing him things with incorrect wrench identification. His reply was 3 words, mostly, close enough. She smiled at her phone, which was not something she did with her phone very often. But the Chiron went back into the private bay after Mason's operational check, and this time Vivienne drove it herself, on a Sunday morning when the service complex was quiet and the property roads were empty. She took it through the same loop Mason had taken it through, and on the second pass she let it run in the speed band where problems lived, and it ran clean, exactly as he'd said, the full authority of its engineering present and unimpeded. Nothing between her and the road, but the specific accuracy of something built correctly and repaired correctly, and finally, at last, used. She thought about the 10 days. She thought about the $700,000 and the 16 specialists and the clean diagnostic reports and the complete absolute silence of $17 million that wouldn't start. She thought about a man in a worn jacket standing near a parts rack with a clipboard, looking at the car the way you looked at something you recognized. She thought about what it cost to see people accurately and what it cost not to. She thought about what Mason had built in the East Bay and what Dominic and Priya and Garrett had become in it, and what Catherine Ross had added to it, and what the next group of mechanics would add, and the group after that. The slow, real accumulation of knowledge passed person to person in the way that actual knowledge moved, not through documentation or credential or the $100,000 scanner that told you only what the software already knew, but through attention and practice and the specific willingness to keep looking when the easy answer said you were done. She thought about Lily's fox on the whiteboard, still in the lower left corner, still exactly as it had been drawn, alert, looking sideways at something just outside the frame, with the quality of a creature that missed very little. She thought about the question Lily had asked her on the Saturday she'd come to see the space. Are any of them purple? She thought, not yet, but maybe. She brought the car back to the bay and sat in it for a moment after the engine stopped, in the specific silence that followed, and she thought that this was the thing she hadn't understood in the beginning, that the car wasn't what the story was about. The car was where the story started. What the story was about was harder to name and more important. It was about what you missed when you trusted the expensive answer over the experienced one, and what became possible when you stopped. It was about the gap between credential and perception, between what things looked like and what they were, between the documentation and the actual car sitting in front of you with its particular history and its particular faults and its particular weighting. It was about a man who had walked away from prestige to be a father and had carried everything he knew in a canvas bag and hadn't needed anyone to recognize it, had been, in fact, prepared to walk out the door without being recognized, and what it meant that he hadn't, that she'd called him back, that he'd answered. It was about Garrett saying, not yet, and Dominic's handmade timeline, and Priya's 12-paragraph summary with the cushioning taken out, and Marcus at 5:30 in the morning having already done the thing before anyone thought to ask. It was about an 8-year-old girl who put a water bottle in her father's bag every morning and drew a fox on a whiteboard and saw clearly, immediately, without being taught to, that the man who always knew what needed to happen and never made a big deal about it was the one worth paying attention to. These were not the things that ended up in the trade press articles, or the industry journal piece, or the YouTube coverage that had long since moved on to other stories. These were the things that actually happened, the real texture of how something got built, which was always messier and slower and more human than the version that got written down. Vivienne got out of the Chiron. She stood beside it for a moment, her hand on the roof, the nocturne blue cool under her palm. She thought, I almost didn't call him back. She let that be true, fully and without qualification. I almost didn't, and I did. And what came from it is real in the way that real things are real, impermanent in some ways and permanent in others, with costs embedded in it that weren't apparent at the start and wouldn't be fully apparent for a long time. She thought, that's enough. That's what you get, and it's enough. She went back inside. The Chiron stayed in the bay, resting in its own silence, the way things rested when they had been correctly understood and correctly handled and given the care that their nature required. Outside, the afternoon light was moving across the skylights of the East Bay, and inside that space, Garrett was finishing a case by himself for the first time. Mason had left at 3:15, as he always left at 3:15, and Garrett had said, "I've got it," and Mason had nodded and gone. And now Garrett was in the bay with the whiteboard and the workbench and the fox in the corner and the specific silence of a room where serious work happened. And he was looking at a problem the way he'd been taught to look at it, which was the way he'd always been inclined to look at it, but had finally been given the language and the space to do. He found the answer at 4:40. He stood back and looked at what he'd found, and then at the whiteboard, and then at the fox, which looked back at him with its sideways attention, alert to something just outside the frame. "Yeah," he said, to nobody in particular. "Okay." He wrote it up carefully. He documented the process, the wrong turns, the specific moment the right question replaced the wrong one. He did this because Mason had been specific about documentation, not to create a record, but because the wrong turns were part of the knowledge, and the knowledge was only useful if it could be passed on. He was still writing when the bay lights automatically shifted to their evening setting, the warm tone that replaced the white work light when the sensors read the external light declining. He barely noticed. He wrote until the documentation was complete and accurate and said precisely what had happened, including the part where he'd been wrong for 40 minutes and the part where he'd found his way back to the right question. Then he put on his jacket, turned off the lights, and went home. The fox stayed on his whiteboard in the dark, in the lower left corner where it had been since the beginning, looking at something none of them could see. Patient, specific, missing very little.